Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Logos for episode 9 of the Grindset stream, Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Locals, Telegram, Twitter, Facebook, all of which are in the description box. Don't forget that in addition to supporting me on Locals, you can also support me on Buy Me a Coffee and Subscribestar, also in the description box. And as well, at the end of the stream, I'll read supers first and other chats if time allows and are relevant to the discussion. So we're going to have a brief change of pace here. We will still be getting to Moldbug, his actual writing. But since we've gotten about 20 hours in, Logos and I have decided to watch portions of Dave the Distributist's general introduction to Moldbug to see what order what order someone who enjoys Moldbug, used to enjoy Moldbug, got out of it. And of course, he was one that I knew that did a video that a lot of people thought was a really good job of summarizing Moldbug. So basically, we're going to start, and we're not going to watch the whole video because there's going to be an intro and an outro. And, we're going to really only focus in on what Dave the Distributist thinks Moldbug is saying. And then we'll comment based on what we've already read and see if we agree with that interpretation or not. Or maybe he is correctly interpreting Moldbug, but still incorrect based on the knowledge that we have. So, by the way, let us know also if you can hear it. But I think when Logos hits play, we should be able to all hear it. So
yeah.
Go ahead.
I just want to make a quick comment. This isn't picking on Dave in particular or anything like that. Todd always brings up, I don't know why people like Moldbug, what they see in him, whatever. And I just remembered, since I've been subscribed to Dave for a long time, I'm like, wait, didn't Dave do a Moldbug video? We should totally watch that and see from that perspective why, people are getting something out of him. And it's good to break up the monotony too, because we've been going through Moldbug for again, about 20 hours of just reading his blogs and doing commentary. So maybe the change in format will be a nice change of pace. And when we get back to it, it'll be a little bit more refreshing. It's almost like a micro vacation. Yeah, I think that's about it. So I'll start the video now and see what happens.
Yep.
Towards history was much more than just a strange historical occurrence. For Moldbug, this was an indication that we needed to radically reconceptualize the nature of power, cultural consensus, and history itself in the modern world. The problem begins with how we conceptualize power and political consensus, given now that in the modern world, our own political reality and the reality that rules the academy is fundamentally post-Enlightenment, we have come to believe a certain number of myths about human nature. Myths that, if you actually press people on it, they will readily admit that they are false, even though we are expected to assert them publicly. We live in a democratic republic, what we call, in somewhat of a misnomer, a democracy, a place where citizens are looked to be the final arbiter of how society unfolds. As such, we are encouraged to believe that citizens are rational, that they take their cultures, the problems faced by their current society, and their own personal interests, and come up with an opinion through public discourse that they think is best for addressing the problems of the nation and the polity as a whole. We are expected to believe that through public discourse, the exchange of information, and the testing of those opinions inside a political environment, a consensus that is more or less correct will be reached, and this will become the new ruling democratic majority. Most people who are reasonably aware of human nature, including the very founding fathers who originated this system, are and were perfectly aware that this model of human discourse is entirely fictitious. People are influenced by any number of other factors. Mob mentalities emerge, appealing ideas.
All right, so this again, I just want to clarify. One, we don't live in a democracy. Two, what we have is the managed democracy, quote unquote, democracy in scare quotes, of Walter Lippmann and the progressive bureaucratic elites. Second of all, this system, which even, from a Moldbugian perspective is a degradation from the Constitution, was not what the founding fathers gave us. They were critical of a democracy. They wanted a republic or a mixed government. Now, we've moved away from that. Now, I would argue in favor of an oligarchy, not a democracy. And the other thing is a lot of this about the informed voter is just a sort of bromide to keep people asleep. Now, this is just reiterating what I've said before on the Moldbugs, but I just want to say it again because I think that the first objection we're going to have is the way this whole thing is framed.
Yeah, I mean, to add a little bit of my own to this, it's not clear from the Enlightenment that we get this idea that human beings are fundamentally rational and all this stuff. There's a way to defend democracy from an Enlightenment perspective that actually does not assume the rationality of human beings, and that's if you just go through the route of like Hobbes and his progenitors, his students, and so on. The idea basically here is democracy is the last arbiter, not because people are fundamentally rational and they know what's best for society, but democracy is the last arbiter because if enough people feel hard done by enough in society, that they think going back to nature, so to speak, is better than dealing with what they've got now. They'll flip the apple cart, you'll get a revolution. So if you're in government, democracy is your best way to keep your pulse on the populace to figure out how far has gone too far. Are taxes too high? Are the laws too onerous? What's going on? And democracy is kind of like the last stopgap between you and revolution. And if you're in charge, if you're the government, you want to keep power. That's like one of your, it's Machiavelli 101. Your first order of business as government is ensuring you maintain power over time. And democracy, in that vein, is just a tool to do it, not some altruistic goodness of our heart, bleeding heart belief in the rationality of human beings. So it's not clear that there's just this simple view of the Enlightenment that Moldbug talks about.
Yeah.
That are wrong spread like wildfire, and certain swings in public opinion are readily observable. As Winston Churchill so famously said, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can even get its pants on. And it's true, bad ideas do have a way of spreading, even though they are wrong, almost like a disease or a virus. It might be useful in many ways to model the spreading of bad ideas as viruses. In fact, this has become a quite popular mode of conceptualizing human knowledge post-2007, especially in the wake of thinkers like Daniel Dennett. Religion is like a mind virus. Radical Islam is like a mind virus. Nazism, communism, socialism are like mind viruses. They spread from person to person, irrespective of their veracity. Here, I think it comes as no surprise that very few people describe ideas that they hold as viruses. But to take this model seriously, what would happen if we did model all ideas as viruses? Returning to our initial example at least, modeling the right versus left, or in the American context, the red versus blue dynamic, as if both were viruses of the mind, taking control of their hosts and spreading for their own interests, and not because they were believed or not believed. Which virus would be the more powerful strain? The left-wing blue virus or the right-wing red virus?
Okay,
Which would be the strain that would...
So one thing is, I will agree here with Dave that most people don't view their own set of beliefs as a virus. But second of all, I'll just reiterate briefly again my objection to the idea of ideas as viruses in the first place. And for the record, I think what Dave is saying here is not that he accepts ideas as viruses, but if one were to do so, which is what Moldbug does, what then would we conclude? But I would argue that, there are, right, ideas aren't things out there in the world that are reproducing like a virus responding to environmental conditions. Last night, Logos, we privately talked about philosophy. Ideas only cause other ideas can only directly create other ideas, not other material realities. And of course, for example, the new atheists were criticizing was not just a set of ideas, but a set of realities that these ideas created.
Yeah, to add something to that, to clarify the conversation for the audience, we were talking about the principle of proportionate causality and the idea of whatever is in the effect must be in some sense in the cause. And if all you have in the cause is an idea, but the effect is something physical, tangible, and so on, ideas aren't sufficient to get you the physical, tangible portions. And so it's like, imagine you have the idea of a computer in your head, but you never go about to actually taking metal and silicon and putting things together and actually like constructing one. Well, the idea of a computer is all you'll ever have. And that leads me to an interesting question that this hearing things talked about this way has got me to think about. I didn't think thought about before previously. If ideas are viruses, how do you inoculate against them? This is something I don't think we've given a lot of thought to, right? It seems to me, upon hearing this and what we've read of Moldbug mostly, that ideas are kind of like viruses that just grab people. But obviously, ideas don't take everybody, right? There's some people that just like never get attached to communism, never get attached to libertarianism, never get attached to whatever, right? So for whatever reason, ideas just never grab some people, even if they're exposed to them a lot all the time. Now, it seems to me there are two ways to inoculate against viruses. One way is with other ideas. So, Todd, we've talked a lot about like your journey to libertarianism a long time ago, and what did it for you was the topic of like abortion and or children in a libertarian model. So, the idea of children versus the idea of the libertarian model kind of conflicted, and that kind of popped you out of it. But I think the most important thing, which I don't think Moldbug considers enough, is physical conditions. So who is going to sign up for a 1917 revolution if they're actually doing pretty well in society? If you look at revolutionary ideas like communism, progressivism, things like that, more often than not, I mean, you can say what you want about the top echelon of people, like the elites, the technocrats, and so on, but the people who'd be boots on the ground, burning things down and doing the revolutionary stuff, I don't think the ideas would take to them if they didn't think there was something fundamentally wrong with society. Likewise, I don't think, we skipped the first 20 minutes or so of the video where Dave's talking about like the problems in society that would get him to read Moldbug. If those problems didn't exist for Dave and he thought that society was hunky-dory and everything was great, he probably wouldn't care much about the ideas of Moldbug. They wouldn't take in him. And this goes back to what we talk about with Moldbug a lot, Todd, where we talk about like Moldbug talks about progressivism and all the harms it did, right? And we talked about like, well, why did we get progressivism in the first place? The part of the analysis not talked about is like what the corporations did to make people go, yeah, cars driving out with Gatling guns mowing down workers, probably not great. I don't know. You got any thoughts on that?
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. And, the other thing is, again, if we're going to use this analogy, which again, I don't like, the way that if we look at, Pasteur and the way that he inoculated people was he gave them a less lethal dose of the disease. So he noticed, right, milkmaids that had gotten cowpox were much more resistant to smallpox, because smallpox wasn't lethal, wasn't going to kill you, but it gave you the antibodies necessary to fight off smallpox because they were closely related enough. And so I suppose what you'd want to do in that case is find something close enough to the thing you're trying to fight. And then, but if you follow it to its logical conclusion, would move you in a totally different direction, would then get that person to move. Or rather to move in your direction, or i.e. not move in the direction you don't want.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So real quick, before you start, why don't you maximize the screen that you're playing to full?
It's a good idea.
There you go.
Would most likely cause a pandemic. We can examine each closely in turn. The red right-wing virus transmits itself mainly through institutions like churches, small communities, rural organizations, and families. It likes targeting the populations of Middle America, the rural poor, the military, and far-flung conservative religious communities. Its transmission mechanism is slower, intergenerational, and genetic, and in our present age, it captures generally old power and those who are in the center of things. By contrast, our blue left-wing virus likes working through mass media institutions, the government, and school systems. It likes targeting populations of urban professionals, celebrities, teachers, and academics. Its transmission mechanisms are fast, mimetic, and media-oriented. The blue virus captures the poor and the...
I'm going to argue that 3, I think, needs to be reworked, right? Because we might say that now, right, the left has captured all these institutions, but really, I think the left moves slowly, right? Let's go back to the Fabians of the 1880s. Hence the name, Fabius Maximus, the delayer, the Roman general who beat Hannibal. They, over 100 years ago, decided a slow, methodical approach was the best way to achieve hegemony in the West. And they were right. That's how they achieved hegemony in the West. Okay, yes, now that they are in power, it seems to move quickly, but that's also a function of technology, right? As technology, the change from one state to the next gets faster and faster and faster, it's going to speed up. But that's not necessarily an aspect of the left. That's an aspect of the left being embedded in a rapidly advancing society. I I think actually they move slowly, going back to the Fabian school.
Yeah, I think the fine point we could put on this, giving the contrast Dave is trying to set up, is something like the red moves slowly intergenerationally through children. The right does this. The left moves slowly intergenerationally through institutions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ascendant, but also the richest and most powerful heights of our present society. Now, given this perspective and brief rundown, we immediately can see that these two viruses are in no way equal. Imagine, for instance, looking at this diagram, we were betting men, and we were trying to predict which virus would capture more power and influence in the long term if unleashed upon a population. Which would you choose, red or blue? Well, the blue virus, obviously. What is Middle America and a vast population of fuddy-duddies next to the commanding heights of media, education, and the coastal corporate elite? Once more, the victor is the left with a bullet. We often look upon the contemporary contest between left and right, red America versus blue America, as if it were the contest between two equal and opposite forces. But this, in the mind of Mencius Moldbug, is a ridiculous proposition. The left has more cultural power. I remember making these initial observations about left versus right in the middle of the Bush administration, where there was no...
So, okay, he mentioned specifically Moldbug here. Now, this is important, right? Because Moldbug, and I also watched Moldbug's relatively recent debate with Ben Burgess. But what hasn't changed in the 15 years since he started Unqualified Reservations is his idea that the quote left is more powerful because it has these institutional capture. So it's the sort of cultural institutions, the educational institutions, the media institutions. Now, as you and I both know, Logos, we can find people on the left who bemoan the fact that, we're going into a rightist tyranny. And it's like, well, wait a minute. How is that even possible, given that they've, on paper won the culture war? And what they would say, and what Moldbug leaves out, and I think what Dave has left out here, is that what they would identify as the right is corporate power. And as far as like rolling back the 8-day work week, all the protections that unions provided, that's incredibly powerful. And that now Moldbug would say that those people either A, don't have power, which is ridiculous, or B, that they're left. That they might be left, but many of the far radical leftists, like the Marxists, and that we've talked to, they don't believe that. They believe that they're still in opposition to them. So I think this whole framing, which again is Moldbug's framing, is deeply flawed.
Yeah, I think a big issue is there's multiple strains of left leaning, right? You've got like the Marxist left, you've got the I'm going to call them the racial identitarian left, you've got the neoliberal globalist left, and they're not all the same left. Sometimes they'll be on the same page for certain policies, and sometimes they'll work together and put some issues off to the side to try to get some agenda going. But they're definitely not exactly all the same faction, and so each component of the left can look at the other ones as dangerous. So like the racial identitarian left would look at anywhere Marxists control institutions and say, this is an optimal vortex, this is bad for race in America, whatever. The Marxists would look at anywhere those people have power and say this is postmodernism, it denies dialectical materialism, it's anti-scientific, it's crazy. The globalists look at both of them like they're crazy because they want like a triangulated, right? This is like the Clintonite left. They want a triangulated consensus to get people basically to lull to sleep while they, do some global stuff that they're always working with. And people can't be asleep if those two are always flaring up and causing all these, social micro revolutions and whatever else is going on. If they're always paying attention, that it's hard to, do the things they want to do. They're not always friends. The other question that isn't addressed, I think, is, okay, we're in this world where the left's captured the institutions, but Dave mentioned the right is old power, and Moldbug said this too. How is it that the right went from the power to the old power, and the left has taken over all the institutions? Unless you have an analysis for that, I don't think this analysis is going to do much good. Let's suppose the right wins. Let's suppose Moldbug, neo-reactionaries, whatever, they work, they get right back in power. How are they going to stop the left from taking power again? Unless you can explain like how they got it in the first place, you're just going to kind of reset the circle and on it goes. I
Yeah.
reckon what they're going to try to say is I haven't seen this. They're going to give, I think, some model of like entropy, like, oh, you know, once society just goes on and it works, there's this entropy that builds up and just kind of makes things left and so on. I don't think that's going to be a very good explanation. We'll see when we get there.
Well, I will say that the day does get to that point, so we'll deal with it when he gets there.
Absolutely.
End of progressive belly aching about how out of power and marginalized the left wing was in the contemporary political environment. And even before reading Mencius Moldbug, I remember thinking that this was bullshit. The majority of the governmental, educational, media, and research institutions that my peers interacted with in their daily lives, and that my peers would interact with going forward, were totally dominated by the left wing. The only thing that was dominated by the right, the only thing that could be dominated by the right, was the upper level of the federal government, an office that shifted between the left wing and the right wing of the political spectrum every 4 to 8 years. When my progressive friends seriously trade their dominance in the academy, the government, and the social services for another 8 years of power in the presidency and the Congress, would progressive people feel more comfortable in an America where the school systems and universities were Republican if only Al Gore had won the 2000 presidential election?
Okay, hold
Obviously
up.
not. What became clear to myself.
Okay, so remember, this is going back to the original, so his college years. So this is like probably the late 90s, early 2000s. Of course, Moldbug starts writing in 2007. Okay, remember, I noticed the picture here, Bush and Gore. So this is the war. Well, that's 1999, 2000. This was before the corporations went woke and before they tried to pretend to be friends of the left. So we have to remember the time in which this is being set. The 1999 was the big protests against globalism in Seattle by a lot of anti-globalist leftist forces, and this is still about a decade before Occupy Wall Street gets off the ground. I mean, again, unless you think corporations aren't real or don't have power, then this falls apart. His leftist friends could say, "Well, hey, Dave, look at all these megacorps all over the world. Look at globalism. Look at this point it'd be the war in Yugoslavia. Look at all this stuff. You telling me that this is quote left wing? This is what we on the left want?" They'd say no. They'd say we want to reduce the military budget. They'd say we want to have more healthcare, social security, and internal development. So I'm not buying this.
Yeah.
And also coincidentally Mencius Moldbug, was that when it came to setting the cultural tone and the overarching narrative of society, the left was dominant. In fact, not just dominant, but unassailable. Moreover, it was this cultural consensus that ultimately determined where the country would go in the long run. Although we have a two-party system, Mencius Moldbug pointed out that it might be better to model Democrats and Republicans less as the left and right wing of an assembly, and more as the inner and outer parties of a single fixture, like in the novel 1984. The inner party develops the real agenda and the outline of where society is going in the long term. The outer party exists more or less as a peanut gallery, taking power temporarily and moving in the same direction as the inner party wants, but at a slower speed. The main utility of the outer party is creating the perception of opposition and discourse for what really is a predetermined conclusion. Now, while this analogy Moldbug uses is quite illustrative, it is important here to point out that he is not proposing a giant conspiracy, as was depicted in Orwell's 1984, but rather a consensus. Despite what
So this, maybe we're not far enough in Moldbug, but I just don't see any evidence that the Republicans are like a quote-unquote exoteric party. Like, where does he say that, right? The way he talks about the Brahmins on the one hand and then the optimists on the other, they're locked in this mortal combat. There's no compromise here.
Well, he's talked about it a little bit in the sense that he said that the president and even to some extent Congress are kind of useless. Moldbug has mentioned several times that like the press, the professors in colleges and so on, he calls it the polygon. He hasn't started calling it the cathedral yet. He calls it the polygon. And this polygon is the real power behind the throne. And the president, Congress, or whatever ultimately do what they say even if only after a bit of bickering and fighting. A good example of that would be like the gay marriage question. Hillary Clinton against it. Consensus for it was manufactured. Suddenly she's for it, basically. Hence the Hillary Clinton quote, I was for it before I was against, or I was against it before I was for it, or whatever she said. That was kind of, funny back in the day. It's basically that picture that's being painted.
All right, keep going.
What Alex Jones might think, the leaders of the Democratic Party, Hollywood, and the corporate elite aren't gathering together in a smoke-filled room and determining what the consensus of the cultural norms are going to be in America.
Okay, now I'm going to stop it. World Economic Forum says hi. Davos says hi. Like, they have all these festivals all over the world where academics, elites in Hollywood and so on all gather, all talk, all do this sort of stuff. I don't know. I think there absolutely is conspiracy.
Instead, there's just a general consensus, a general agreement that has emerged among elites, and that people who enter the elite are encouraged to believe. But if we live in a truly open society, an open democratic project, then how can this consensus even emerge to begin with? Here, Mencius Moldbug takes aim at the concept of the open society, as described by people like Karl Popper. What if we conceptualized social control more broadly than simply an open democratic republic versus a closed totalitarian or authoritarian system? Say, for instance, if we modeled a completely open society as a Type 1 society, one that had almost no controls on the types of ideas that could be said or thought about in any way, shape, or form. To contrast this, we could compare it to a totally closed society, like North Korea, where every aspect of a person's life is completely controlled by ideology, by ideas that have to be asserted, and asserted enthusiastically within every communal interaction. Now, while these pure Type 3 societies are exceedingly rare in human history, very few governments want total social control over a people's ideology, I think it is fair to say that the pure Karl Popper Type 1 society has never really existed. In fact, Moldbug goes on to point out that in terms of social control, most of what a society does to maintain order is done through a loose societal consensus over what is acceptable and what is not. This consensus is usually not designed and exists pre-politically, operating mainly through social pressure and originating in the academic and educational institutions in society. This consensus-generating system is loose.
Okay, this is directly tied to your objection. Yes, there is a conspiracy. Yes, there are all these globalist organizations that meet up, the G20, the G8, the World Trade Organization, all of these things. But also, see, this is what's bizarre about the Moldbug perspective, right? Is on the one hand, he'll claim that his opponents on the left are all these sneaky, wily, entryist infiltrators with ulterior motives to, subvert the meaning of the word justice and take over institutions. But then it's like, no. There's no conspiracy at all, guys. What are you talking about? They're just people coming together to do stuff. They're just people doing stuff. Well, which is it?
Yeah, they just all happen to agree. I think the model he's trying to paint here is something like the left takes the educational institutions. The educational institutions pop out journalists that then take the media, the educational institutions subtly give social memes that the elites are supposed to, believe in polite society, and so on. It propagates. That's the best I can defend him.
Yeah. All right.
Loose and fluid, it extends over governments, in between them, creating sort of an unofficial multinational method of thinking and rules for determining what ideas are good and what ideas are unacceptable. The classic example of this is none other than the medieval society that originated in Europe post 1000 AD and persisted until the Reformation, where the Catholic Church and the strictures set aside by the Catholic Church were the de facto societal consensus. It didn't matter.
Hold on, I gotta stop it here. The Catholic Church was not a de facto societal consensus. They actually got together in councils. They set what was heretical. There could be absolute punishments for breaking heresies that were bad enough. This is a top-down, they actually had councils that got together to figure out what was going to be the social consensus. This is the last thing you want to point to say this is not a conspiracy.
Well, not only that, the East, do we mean nothing to you?
The East.
Well, in the Middle Ages, Eastern Christendom was Orthodox.
That's true.
So, I mean, that?
Yeah.
Whether your loyalties lie to the Holy Roman Empire, to France, or to Britain, to Hungary, or the Kingdom of Poland, at the end of the day, you had been educated under Catholic guidelines. You asserted Catholic religious beliefs, and you had a Christian and scholastic methodology about solving problems. This is what Moldbug called the Cathedral, and it, more than anything else, is what defines a civilization. It is an organized system of consensus about how a society should run and should be operated going into the future. Implicitly, this is a very useful term when it comes to understanding our own political environment. What is the advantage the Democratic Party has? Well, in short, the Democratic Party is aligned to the desires of the Cathedral, the general consensus of the Academy, and others who generate ideas about how society should move forward. Everyone else are heretics to a certain degree, acceptable heretics in most cases, but nevertheless out of sync with where the correct opinion is. Alright, we have come up with an idea of the Cathedral, perhaps a better way of explaining political dynamics in contemporary America. But how does this help in better understanding the dynamics of history, the reason why the societal consensus, or the cathedral, if you will, always shifts to the left? What creates this left-wing force in history? Here, I might be permitted one more digression to one almost forgotten English political party, the Whigs. Now, while the Whigs' political objectives in the near term are now almost forgotten and not relevant for this talk, they, and their later sympathizers in the 19th century, were famous for first pointing out this constant change in history, this direction of reform and improvement that seems to go on in one direction. This is, of course, the Whig view of history, as it is famously explained. A funny, anachronistic juxtaposition, however, that still might give us some insight into this reforming force of history is done by overlaying the Whig view of history with Samuel Johnson's equally famous quote about the Whigs, that indeed Lucifer himself was the first Whig. Here, while I think Samuel Johnson's original point was that Lucifer was the first rebel against the crown's interest, the crown being God, might we not better understand the leftward direction of history if we incorporate a Luciferian element into our analysis? By assuming, in contrast, that history moves left because the left is always correct, with history moves to the left because the left is always evil. At once it seems like we may have replaced an explanation that is overly flattering to the leftists with an explanation that is overly flattering to conservatives and those who oppose the left. Still, if we vary our analogy a little bit and move to the realm of physics, we might ask ourselves if the fundamental time-dependent force in history that moves everything to the left is not equivalent to, or at least analogous to, the fundamental time-dependent phenomenon in physics, what physicists call entropy. What if progress, what if the leftward force in history is simply entropy, dissolution, degeneration? Just like a teacup in nature, once knocked down, shatters, but does not, in nature, reassemble itself. Perhaps the tendency of all things in nature to become more left-wing is a type of shattering, a type of winding down, a phenomenon where societies and social institutions themselves slowly are degraded as time progresses.
Okay.
Under this explanation...
Okay, so I'm not going to say all that I want to say here because there's going to be not really a tie-in, but at least a partial recognition of the concern that I'm going to bring up. So I'm going to bring this more up later. But the idea that the leftward drift, and we've already established here this leftward drift is cultural, is the result of entropy, is garbage for a lot of reasons. Let's look at the first one. Civilizations have risen and fallen throughout history, and yet we've never had feminism before. We've never had, transgender political movements before. The stuff that we see now has no precedent in the past, really. And actually, far from the degradation of order, all of these social behaviors are the result of the hypertrophy of order under technology and machines. So machines are a drastic reduction in entropy and create this highly ordered, though unnatural environment. And in this highly ordered, unnatural environment, all of these leftist values flourish. And so that's why the left has often been scientific, right? Scientific Marxism. And so it's as entropy is reduced by the technology and machines, we are able to have these lifestyles. So if we were to imagine a collapse, and I take Tainer's definition, a high energy state to a low energy state. In a low energy state, if you look at, say, the fictional works of James Howard Kunstler, World Made by Hand, a lot of these lefty social values go bye-bye, because in an entropic state of nature, you can't sustain those behaviors. So this is just not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of kind of like a black box fallacy, right? Where we think we've got the solution for why we have this leftward drift through history. Well, it's this idea of entropy from physics, right? It's just like, well, entropy is the cause of society's drifting leftward. And it's just like, well, hold on a minute. Why couldn't entropy be the cause of society's drifting rightward? If all entropy is kind of like an artifact gained through the arrow of time, it could be order, disorder, whatever. What is it that makes it the case that entropy points leftward instead of rightward? Just calling the leftward shift entropy doesn't really address that question, and the question still needs to be answered. So appealing to some other symbolic gesture like entropy or something else, it doesn't do it for me. The other problem too is you have the Spenglerian cycle, which I think Dave takes and we take and most people take to be, obvious. It's just, civilizations get too lax, they collapse, they rebuild, they get stronger. Well, like Dave said, a teacup never puts itself back together in nature. But how is it that fallen empires can put themselves back together if the left truly is an entropic force? If the left truly is an entropic force, then fallen empires shouldn't rebuild like we did in the Middle Ages. They should continue to shatter and shatter and shatter. The shards of the teacup should dissolve into the soil and just completely just meld into the system, never to be seen again. But the fact that civilizations pick themselves up and repair themselves once they're faced with more real problems that technology can't solve, tells us that thinking about this as an entropic force isn't going to work.
Well,
and
I was going to say more than that. Given the Moldbug, and I think many interactors believe that scientific, we'll get to science a bit later, technological and scientific progress is progress. It's some good, right? That Moldbug explicitly believes this.
Right.
Many interacts do. Well, then the Soviet Union was the opposite of entropic, right? They took this medieval backwater called Russia and turned it into a space-age civilization by 1957. That's the opposite of entropy.
That's true. I mean, as we joke, though, Stalin had to go pretty conservative to get there.
Right. But then this just creates problems for the neo-reactionary analysis, right? If the leftward drift is entropy, then why was the Soviet Union at a higher level of material conditions than Tsarist Russia, which according to NRX would be less entropic?
It's true.
Okay.
We see once more that the left-wing push in history, the Whig explanation of history, if you will, does have a certain Luciferian nature. Progress is simply a move towards more chaos, as history inevitably goes forward into the future.
Okay, stop.
As society...
No, that's ridiculous. So let's say you have a 12-hour workday, okay?
Right.
Progress is getting you to an 8-hour workday with benefits and safety precautions. Now, that's the work of the devil? Really? Really? I mean, that's a pretty bold claim there, Logos. I think an 8-hour workday with benefits and safety measures was a good thing. And that's often called progress.
Right. And to tie this together, right? If technology is bad, if let's say you just landed America on the Mayflower and you're trying to build a wall to keep the animals out, and you're trying to plant crops in a hurry so you can harvest them and have food to eat and so on, right? Every person's on deck. You can't worry about safety conditions and work days because stuff gets done or we die. And so literally we need everything everybody can give all the time. That's one state of nature. Now, the problem is what the progressives and the left notice. This is talked about by Marxists all the time. Is you have surplus. You're producing surplus capital. The idea is you're causing people to do all this work, 12-hour work days in unsafe conditions, as if we're getting off the Mayflower and we're all kind of spreading the wealth and just trying to make it together. But what's going on is you've got these corporations raking in massive profits from all the stuff that the workers are doing. Now, what's going on here is to tie your technological narrative together with Dave's progress narrative. What's going on here is we have a level of technology such that the people don't have to work that hard and that demanding to produce all this value. The groundwork's been laid. We have these machines. We can produce a heck of a lot at a more reasonable work pace now. We don't have to like existentially go crazy over it. What that means is that technology has supplanted regimen. It's supplanted the need for institutions to be harsh on people for our very survival. As technology fills in that vacuum, we get leisure back. We get leisure time back. We get the ability to degrade the ability for the institutions to control us because technology is handling it more. And so we can take more of our lives back, so to speak, without this being a life or death situation.
Yeah, go ahead.
One more quick comment. So the work week is a place where this might be good, right? Now, a place where me and Todd talk about where this might be not so good is, I mean, let's just think about like sexual norms. One of the reasons why we had such strict sexual norms back in the day was because of STDs. Now, what's happened is our ability pregnancies. Now, what's happened is our ability to treat pregnancies, STDs, whatever, deal with those consequences have gone up. Sexual norms have gone down. And that's another place where Dave might point out progress, or insanity or chaos of the progressive idea. Because what's going on is our technological constraints force certain family structures. And conservatives would look at those family structures as an intrinsically good thing. But what's going on is technology, allowing us to be more loose with our sexual norms, has then by extension permeated into the family structures those sexual norms supported. You soften the sexual norms, you soften the family structure. But again, it's technology doing the supplanting here. You're trading the regimen in social institutions because you can trade it away to what technology gives you. And so as long as you think of technology, that this technological progress is an inherently good thing, this is going to keep happening over and over and over again. You're going to throw your hands up and keep calling it entropy.
Let me just put it this way. TLDR, technological development is not entropy.
Right.
Simple.
Moves forward, institutions are not so much improved by progress, but slowly torn down, stripped of their fundamentals, and worn away. As Moldbug would put it, Cthulhu swims slowly, but he always swims to the left. Certainly, this explanation has a certain parsimonious nature to it. Things of their own accord tend to wind down, tend to fall apart. Institutions tend to fall apart over time. Just like things in the physical world, we don't need a further explanation. The identification of the left wing with entropy, with slow degeneration, also goes a long way at explaining why the left tends to win over time, and also why we can identify what is left and what isn't before it actually does win. We are not clairvoyant, we are not seeing the future in any incredible way, any more than we are noticing that a teacup once smashed is not going to reassemble itself. Still, this explanation is vague. It's all well and good, as Mencius Moldbug does, to associate the left with entropy, but what exactly is being degenerated? What is wasting away? Dissolution and chaos, from analogy to religion and analogy to physics, tends to have a negative connotation. If you were to ask me whether I want my society to be degenerated, I would probably say no, simply out of emotional association. Yet still, we haven't specified yet what is being degenerated. What if it's something bad? What if what is slowly melting away is oppression? In that case, the entropic model of the left would still be more or less correct, but the left would still be a good thing, at least under most people's views. So what is being degenerated and destroyed over time? Well, it can't be living standards. things have gotten better for the most part. We might be more progressive than those old fogies in the early 18th century, and perhaps this means we are more chaotic in the Jordan Peterson sense of the word. But in terms of wealth and technology, we are by far their superiors. We may be in the process of dissolution societally. We may be degenerating, but if technology and wealth increases, we'll be degenerating all the way to the bank. So if our living standards aren't degenerating, what is actually the subject of the left's entropy? Well, as Moldbug would put it in a word, or at least...
Yeah, I mean, if you're not like the working poor, I guess your your living standards aren't degenerating. I mean, even as of 2007 and 8, now this was, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, so this is even on the other side of Occupy Wall Street. There was the whole austerity crisis, 2007, 2009, throughout Europe and America. So, yeah, plenty of people saw their standard of living declining and were upset. Like, this is coming from the point of view of a very specific position within the class structure.
Yeah, I mean, he could be making the Ben Shapiro talking point that, like, poor people today have microwaves and plasma TVs and phones and, you know, all this technological stuff they wouldn't have had in the 1800s. So, like, even some of our most poorest people in America today live better than some aristocracy back in the 1800s or whatever. I think that's the general gist.
Okay.
A Greek word, nomos, rules, laws, customs, and implicitly the promises and commitments that stem from those rules and customs. And here, of course, we mean rules and laws in the most general sense, in the broadest cultural sense. Saying that all men should take their hat off before the king is part of nomos. But so is saying that boys should wash their hands before supper. Saying that all good churchmen should observe the holy days of obligation is nomos, and so is the military draft. And here we come to a simple explanation of what is left, and what is, by converse, right. The left is antinomian, the right is pronomian. If we look at human organization through history, and human organizations generally, we see that each in turn are made up of promises and rules. One person, usually an authority, promises something to those who are lower, and in exchange he is raised up in the hierarchy and is able to make the rules for the rest of society. This is a very basic model, but you will see it again and again in everything from the establishment of ancient civilizations and kings to corporate boardrooms. You also even see it in the case of religions and gods. It is no accident that the first religious testament that we have in the Bible concerns the development of a covenant, a promise made by God, and subsequently rules set out to govern the people in order that God can fulfill that promise. The core cultural element that binds a society together on a political and pre-political level. Alright, so this might be an observation about how society is formed, but how does this play into our idea of reform and possibly the dissolution of institutions? Well, as we might expect, with promises and rules, the social order of a society, or really any institution, can't remain static. Norms need to be modified to accommodate changes. There needs to be some flexibility and modification. Some rules need to be renegotiated, or possibly even reneged on. Things change. But here comes a problem. When one makes a rule or a promise in turn, one limits possibilities and potential. Human operations are constrained. By breaking a rule, we are more liberated. We are free to make new commitments and to enjoy life in an unconstrained fashion. However, if we break promises and break faith with the rules that are made at any given time, the authority that is making those promises and making those rules loses credibility. The entire system is weakened and potentially even collapses. At some point, if we break too many rules, nothing works, and here there is a trade-off that all civilizations need to make. How loose do we want to be with our own rules and promises? For want of an immediate analogy in the modern world, we could use the monetary system and the printing of promissory notes on paper currency. Issuing the initial currency is like an initial covenant with the people and their creditors. We print bills and then borrow those bills to buy what we need and what we think we can pay back in the future. However, as the people and the government go into debt, it finds it necessary to break, or rather bend, its promises in the printing of promissory notes by printing more and more money, inflating the currency, making it easier to pay its debts, and in turn, easier to borrow and spend money as it wants, worry-free. However, print too many promissory notes, and people will lose faith with the currency. There will be hyperinflation, an accelerating, metastasizing collapse of the society, and the ability of anyone to use money to negotiate for things that they need. For perhaps yet another simpler example, we might imagine the trade-off between pronomian and antinomian perspectives, the trade-off between strict rules and loose ones, being like the ant and the grasshopper from the famous Aesop's fables. The rule says work every day hard to store for the winter. Break the rule one day and you get a nice day off, a break in the ordinary pattern of existence and a chance to enjoy life. But break the rule every day, as the grasshopper in the title of the fable, and you will starve come winter. And so it goes with societies. The rules can be bent, but if they're broken, all hell breaks loose. Things fall apart, order breaks down, trust evaporates.
I'll pause it here. This is a really, really good way of saying basically what we've been saying about technology, right? Suppose technology, this ant stumbles into some technology such that the level that he has to work at is only half of what he did before to make it through the winter. Now, if the ant only has to work half as hard to make it through the winter as he ordinarily would have, then why should the ant have to work every day, right?
Yeah, well, that's what the left says.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's what a lot of reasonable people would say. What are we storing all this extra grain for? What am I doing all this extra stuff for? We have enough to make it through the winter. We're fine. Who's pocketing all the rest of it? You're asking me to work harder, and who is it profiting me to do it, or is it profiting like the profits of some corporation to do it, or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the relationship between technology and the way this stuff breaks down. As people expect that technology will keep making their lives easier and easier and easier, they're going to keep looking to social rules more and more and more and saying, why am I following these rules when I've got all these systems to catch me?
Right, but there's another thing too here. There's a couple of things here actually. So, okay, on the one hand, I agree with the idea of the left being anti-law and the right being law. Right, I've said before that there's this Luciferian streak of "I will not serve," seeking to subvert norms and standards. Now, but there's a sense in which that's not true, and so, for example, there's the famous quip from Ivan and the brothers Karamazov that without God, anything is permissible, right? And that's the Dostoevskian critique of atheism. And there's some truth to that. But what ends up happening is as this process continues, there's a trap that develops. Because Slavoj Žižek stated that without God, nothing is possible. Because he makes an appeal to the Freudian conception of killing your father. And then that creates a sense of guilt that as soon as we get rid of old laws that were associated with the father we killed, i.e. God, we then have to invent new laws, which are even more of a straitjacket to assuage us of our guilt. And so what ends up happening is you have that these atheists, liberals, progressives are actually more bounded by laws. They may not be reasonable, but within their framework, that's what they believe is their sort of catharsis for killing God. And then also the idea of treating these assaults on traditional norms and extension of technology as just undirected processes like in nature is just not true. I mean, the technological process itself is directed by human minds. It's not a natural process. It's not organic. It doesn't happen on its own. If humans didn't participate in the maintenance of it, it would disappear. Whereas
Right.
whether we're there or not, we're still going to have natural processes. And so this erosion, the entropy that we are seeing, is that this goes back to my discussion about simulations. The older social norms were suited for an older mode of material production, an older mode of material existence. Now that we are in a new mode of material existence, in order to interface humans with this new technological society, they're going to have new values. So it's not like they're degrading values with no end in sight as a sort of like nihilistic expression of self-destruction. They're doing this in order to create a new man that fits into the current level of technological existence.
Exactly. And where this really risks being self-destructive is if they overshoot given a level of technology, but also if we can't sustain the level of technology indefinitely. So, for example, if we hit peak oil or if something happens and we lose the ability to maintain the levels of energy, but people still have these social expectations of very lax rules of living or so on, a lot of people are going to die because they're just not ready for the shift that just happens as the technology buckles beneath them.
Yeah.
And men cannot rely on their fellow men. And therein we can imagine, again, a balance, a pattern that takes place in most societies. The antinomian, bleeding heart grasshoppers telling society to make exceptions, to ease up, to let loose, to take a break from the promises and rules that define the society. The pronomian, fuddy-duddy ants sticking to order and the old ways, and cautioning society that if it does ease up, that if it does slack from its duties, that if it does show too much mercy, the world will come to a bad end. Society will starve come winter, and the barbarian hordes will be at the gates. But after everything, does this explain the progressive direction of history over the long term? Well, not really. If there was a trade-off like this, we would expect that our world would be simpler, that equilibrium would be reached, and that history itself would involve small cycles between these two forces, rather than a single direction. And this type of cyclical equilibrium might be the case if nothing changed. But of course, things do change. In particular, technology changes.
Hey, he did bring it up. Look at that.
Well, I told you he was going to, but I don't think it's going to be in the direction that we completely agree with.
All right, we'll see.
We'll see.
Human beings do gain knowledge of the world over time, and we pass it on generation to generation. We do improve our understanding, increase our yields, improve our efficiencies, and generate larger margins and cushier boundaries between our families and the hardness of natural existence. And under these circumstances, the calls of the antinomians to loosen the rules and loosen the punishments and partially renege on our promises turn out more often than not to be vindicated. One can imagine a dialogue, hypothetically, between a right pronomian and a left antinomian. Pronomian: the law says work the earth from sunup to sundown. Antinomian: but with the newly invented plows and crop rotations, we need less work. Pronomian: idle hands are the devil's plaything. Antinomian: come, let us enjoy the fruits of our leisure time. I don't think it's hard to see what eventually wins. Technology and wealth come to liberate us from the regulations and strictures we needed to maintain survival in a harsher world, in past worlds. The antinomian triumphs once more due to technology. The progressive obtains victory, and the path of history obtains its well-known leftward bias.
Well, there we go. That seems to be the point that we've been making.
Well, yeah, but I will say this though, right? One is this new system. See, it's ultimately not really antinomian now, is it? Because what it's doing is it's adhering to laws of another system, a mechanical one.
Yeah, kind of. I think they're defining nomian in the very, very narrow definition of like founding laws of society kind of thing.
But the point is, though, once we reach the goal of this machine, and he will get to this, the idea of transhumanism, that's the end state. Without getting into why I think we can't get there, let's say we could get there hypothetically. At that point, there'd be no more rule breaking because we'd be done, and we have a new set of laws.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. It's not because really any order that's asserting itself over an old order has to break down the old order's laws. When Islam took over the Middle East, it had to tear down Eastern Orthodoxy. That doesn't mean that Islam is not a, quote, antinomian religion. It's very law-based. It's just a different set of laws than the Eastern Orthodox Christians.
Good point, yeah.
And through technology and the loosening of norms, humanity is happier, or at least richer, and we return to the pursuit of our goals as people and as civilization with more ease. As technology accelerates, so does the left increase its own ability to become vindicated again and again in its antinomianism, in its tearing down of rules, customs, and in turn, promises. We have finally come to accomplish our task, an explanation of the leftward force in history that explains both the simplicity of progressivism and the predictability and persistence of its victories. Moldbug's model seems to explain the nature of the left and also the predictability of history, the Hegelian idea that the processes of history are intelligibly moving to some kind of condition or outcome. Moving back to our timeline of conservatives, we can see that at every interval, what separates each conservative from the last, what makes Ben Shapiro more progressive than the early 20th century conservative, and what makes the early 20th century conservative more progressive than his 19th century counterpart, is their relationship to the disestablishment of institutional norms, of their belief that certain rules should be done away with or relaxed, that the promises of the older society should be loosened. We have also, with some effort, been able to successfully explain the first two of Conquest's three laws of politics, unlike, I may point out, both the contemporary liberal and conservative commenters. We see that people are more conservative about the things that they love because they're looking to preserve them. And we see the institutions, by their nature, become more progressive or liberal over time because they wind down and degenerate. So, in recognizing that the leftward...
Okay, this is a problem with conquest law, right? So let's say everything is conservative about what he knows best. So let's say we're dealing with a transgender individual, and what that person knows best is the ins and outs of transgender ideology. Is that person really a conservative?
They're conservative given other people. So let's say you have like somebody that's trans in like the 90s or early 2000s, and they're meeting some like Tumblrite tranny in like 2010s that's has all these new pronouns like she and jer and, you know, otherkin and all this stuff. That 2000s trans person is going to be very conservative to the new Tumblrite trans person.
I guess in that case, that just makes conservative a very meaningless term in that case.
Yeah, that's the entire point, is that that's the entire picture being painted, is that conservative is always a relative term to a level of technology and other things that society takes for granted. So like, when society doesn't know much about trans people, the trans person like the 2000s would be super far left. But as societies become super, super accepting of trans people in general, and they're really pushing the boundaries, the your otherkin Tumblrite is going to be looking at the older trans person as conservative because they were trans when society didn't take it for granted. This new person's pushing new boundaries that didn't exist before. So,
and I guess as to two, this part of the problem is that the right and the left in America today use different definitions of right and left, because many people on the left who decry the rise of corporate America, especially since 2011, or even going back to like 1999 with the classic anti-globalist left, would say that everything is trending right because it's being privatized, because it's being commodified. And so you could imagine an inverse second law, call it, Chomsky's law. Any organization that isn't left-wing will sooner or later become right-wing. And by that, he means, pro-market, anti-worker. Right. So, and to be honest, from that perspective, with that definition, there's some truth to that. So I feel like there's a lot of these words need to be better defined.
Yeah, this goes back to one of the very first things we spent a long time talking about, especially in private, how to actually get a good taxonomy of the left and the right, because everybody's done screwing it up.
Yeah, and this isn't really helping advance the discussion, but we'll keep going.
Force of history is driven by humans' technological progress. How do we feel about it? Is not this entire process a good thing? Should we not be grateful for it? Is this not a victory over nature? A victory for humanity? A vindication of the concept of human progress? Well, perhaps, but perhaps not. This type of progress may be the ultimate salvation of humanity, but is there not a fly in the ointment, a critical flaw in the plan? In addition to simply progress or degeneration, whatever you prefer, there's another way of viewing the struggle between antinomian and pronomian forces, or the left and the right, and that is as a transfer. Originally evolving and living in a harsh natural environment, human beings need norms, disciplines, and strictures to ensure that they will survive. And this need for norms persists and perhaps even increases when the dangers of human organization move from being more natural to also involving war and other human rivalries on a large scale. In this sense, technological development acts as sort of a trade-off, replacing internalized human technologies of a disciplined rules and organization with external physical technologies that can offload some of the work. As we invent the lever and the pulley, the discipline put on our muscles can be loosened. As we invent inscription, writing, and stone tablets, we lose the discipline needed to memorize and carry on long oral traditions. Sometimes the technology replaces one discipline, such as memorization, with another, the disciplines involved in writing. Other times, as in the case of modern technological and information entertainment, the core human disciplines are eroded entirely, as modern man becomes increasingly atomized, sedentary, and isolated, losing his contact with both the land and also his fellow man. In this sense, the progress of technology and its subsequent progressivizing influence is a double-edged sword, increasing our wealth but also eroding our humanity. Through progress and the destruction of norms, we erode the rules, orders, disciplines, and promises that would otherwise allow our society to survive in harsher conditions. This is a fundamental decadence, and in Moldbug's conception, technological innovation covers up the degeneration and social disorder that would otherwise be obvious.
Okay, hold on. Does he? Because I haven't found that yet.
Not yet. I mean, again, this is an introduction to his whole blog corpus, and we're still not even knowing the first year yet. But if Moldbug ends up talking about that sort of thing, then his stock's going to go up completely.
Well, again, from where we're at, I don't see any evidence of that. But again, there's a lot more Moldbug to read. So the one thing is, thus far, I agree with Dave's take. The only thing that I would object to here is that the way it's being cast is that the left word drift. So when you appeal to entropy, what you're appealing to is a natural process. Technological development is not a natural process. So we do not naturally drift to the left. We synthetically drift to the left by developing technology. And this is coming from Moldbug, but this is a very muddled way of thinking because it creates the wrong set of assumptions. You get rid of machines, we go back to the old ways immediately because there's no other way.
Well, there is a way in which it can be natural. I've been thinking about this a lot. So, I mean, there are some tribes in the world that continue to live today as they've lived for thousands of years, right? Well, what's interesting about that is if we wanted the land those tribes were on, we could wipe them out with a push of a button and just take it. And so there's been this evolutionary force through history where societies that adapt and gain new technologies and are allowed to do so tend to have advantages in war and conquests and other things, and end up wiping out societies that don't get new technologies because they don't want to change the laws and the way things are. And so if you look at more conservative societies that keep a level of technology getting naturally wiped out by other ones that do, even if the initial learning of technology is kind of like random flashes of insight from some people, that can just be, described as a randomized natural stochastic process.
Well, yeah, I see where you're going with that, but I want to make the distinction between anything that is when we say entropy is a term we use in physics, and it's referring to the natural processes external to the human mind.
Right.
Okay. Now, innovation and creativity is it's not natural in the sense of a natural law. It's not like if humans just stepped back and just watched everything happen and didn't do anything, we'd see technological innovation. We wouldn't. We would just see natural processes. Technological innovation is a product of choice and will. And so in that sense, it's not natural like a law of nature, like the rising and setting of the sun.
That's true, but it could be subject to higher game theory laws. So let's suppose, technology is choice and will. So let's look at the choice and will we have. We can either choose to let people run amok with this new technology. They've say somebody invents the bow and arrow, right? And we could crack down on society and say, no, this bow and arrow thing removes your ability to stalk your prey, and it just degenerates the human condition and removes your discipline. You can't have it, right? Well, let's suppose your neighboring society doesn't. They make the opposite choice. Well, you might have chosen not to pursue the technology, but your neighbors didn't, and your neighbors wipe you out. So independent of your will, your choice, your mind on the matter, you've been wiped out by other humans who are acting as kind of like a natural force against you.
Right. I'm not. Yeah, I know. I'm not saying that humans act. We still have to act within the framework imposed on us by natural laws.
Right.
And that does constrain our choices and actions. But I think admitting that they're constrained by these pre-existing natural laws does not itself mean technology is natural. Because again, prior to 1800, there was no leftward drift. I mean, ancient Egypt, the Greek republics, the Roman Republic, none of these were, quote, left in any meaningful sense, even though they rose and fell over millennia.
Well, I mean, Rome got pretty degenerate, didn't it? I mean, that's where you had like the orgies and sacrificing children to Vespa or whoever. I mean, I think the early Roman Republic was probably not so loose with its sexual norms as like
Sure.
the later Republic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, but this gets again back to the muddle definition of left and right, and we're dealing with Moldbug's framing, so we've already explored that problem before. So
Yeah.
let's keep going.
More fundamentally, in the progress of technology and antinomianism, there is no guarantee that the loosening of the rules and the destruction of promises is only going to impact superfluous institutions that are immediately obsoleted by the emergence of technology.
Logos,
as
you got
the
pop-up
victories
there.
of the antinomian left accrue again and again, as it is further vindicated by technology, the demands will accelerate. The activists on the left will begin to tear down more and more norms, more and more rules, until it begins to cut into living tissue, until it begins to destroy the social organization that society needs to go forward and generate the very technological advance that is needed to justify the leftward antinomian direction in politics to begin with. History does have a leftward direction, but there's no guarantee that it is going to be intelligent about it. Like an autoimmune disorder, the fixture begins attacking healthy tissue. And even while being driven by the progress of technology, there's no guarantee that the antinomian forces it inspires will be at all good for humanity in the long run. Of course, on the surface, both of these defects are rather small, but they can become bigger since there is no implicit mechanism in society to deal with them once they fully accelerate. And so we have a bubble mechanism built into the pattern of history itself. The growth of wealth and technology enables the victories of the left, enables the victories of antinomian forces in society. But soon, the march of progress overtakes the benefits delivered by technology and begins to degenerate and disintegrate social bonds themselves. Just like a market bubble, the societal or civilizational bubble starts by pursuing a useful, valued asset, creates hype and enthusiasm until everything is oversold, and then collapses, destroying the wealth of the people who are foolish enough to invest in it. When a bubble is in its growth period, when the market is in an upswing, when technology and wealth are abundant, if you buy into a bubble, there's immediate benefit. And if you deconstruct social norms or remove social rules that seem unnecessary in the short term, there is much to be gained in the short term. Therefore, an acceleration is experienced that is almost irresistible. Society will go ever further to the left, ever further into deconstruction, until it begins to devour itself. And even within this process, will the leftward movement and acceleration of history always continue towards the left, always continue towards further deconstruction? Well, as the economist Herbert Stein put it, if something cannot go on forever, it will, inevitably, at some point stop. And so, for societies like ours, there are, in fact, two possible endings. In one very unlikely scenario.
So, up to this point, I essentially agree. A good example of this would be the loosening of marriage norms with no-fault divorce. Everybody thought this was great, but now that people don't form families or relationships and we have a shortage of workers due to the upside-down population pyramid, the very real need for employees is now too late to be dealt with because they've already cut so much away.
Yeah, they're going to try to use more technology to fix the problem. Two technological aspects they're looking at to solve it are immigration, using our ability to just bring people from around the world to here. The other thing that they're looking at doing now is actually growing human embryos in labs, just like artificially creating, growing, and so on. That research is actually fairly well developed at this point.
Or robots like Japan with the robot factories.
That's true. Yep.
I hesitate to say optimistic scenario. The process of technological and wealth growth continues, almost indefinitely, until science and technology have obliterated scarcity, and with it, any remnant of anything resembling humanity or the human condition as we understand it today. In this scenario, nothing stops progress. We reach a state of techno-utopia, or go even further and attain what Ray Kurzweil would call the singularity, the point where technology devours humanity itself. In this scenario, we will have reached some kind of culmination, some kind of perfect technology or existence in almost a godlike state. Although I hesitate to say we, since whatever attains this true dizzying height of existence is not going to resemble anything that is human. However, in the other scenario that is much, much more likely to end the constant progression of technology and progress, humanity, or whatever replaces humanity, will come up against some barrier that further technological development cannot solve. In this case, the progression of wealth growth will suddenly halt. The progressive antinomian bubble will burst, and civilization will take an enormous lurch backwards, this time in a truly catastrophic fashion, because after centuries and centuries of left-wing and antinomian victories, there will be little remaining of the social organization that will be able to cushion society when it is no longer able to rely on technological growth. Like a car hitting a brick wall at very high speeds, the entire external apparatus will be disintegrated by the collision, and with it, the death of the civilization and the people it deigns to protect. Leading up to this sudden catastrophe, the activists in government, the administrators of the society, and the culture may even see the disastrous fate that is ahead of them, but they have become slaves of the process that brings society forward. Like a government that is experiencing hyperinflation, the short-term interests of the party in charge is to always continue to print money to pay off short-term debts, regardless of the fact that it will lead to doom for the entire body politic eventually. And here we see another correspondence between Mencius Moldbug's theory.
So, yeah, as far as the fork, I agree. If we take the technological progress system, then it would inevitably end in the replacement of human with machines. I don't think that's very likely, so I agree with Dave in that. As everybody knows, I'm collapse-pilled, so I think it's actually quite inevitable. Because ultimately, the real hard limit they're going to hit first, even before a cultural breakdown, is resources. And we're already seeing it now with peak everything. Everything is becoming just too expensive to operate. Especially with, say, gas for your car is very important. The real important thing to follow is diesel, because diesel is used by trucks to send everything everywhere throughout the United States. And diesel's not going down nearly as much as gas is. Gas has been pushed down by the Biden administration by quite a bit since its high of $5 a gallon 3 or 4 months ago. But diesel's not going down nearly as much. And I think it's this resource limit that's going to hit first.
I agree. Yep.
Theory of government and the very frequently revived idea of civilizational cycles, of the growth, life, and death of cultural groups and their civilizations over the course of centuries. The Cathedral, once more the cultural consensus of a civilization, has a tendency always to move towards deconstruction, towards antinomianism, and towards the left. In our case, the Christian civilization's case, this process began with the Reformation. Then, slowly but surely, the Cathedral begins to shed the external arrangements, the promises, the customs that have...
I would have stopped there.
Because reading the Bible is the same as technological progress.
Well, began with the Protestant Reformation. We've been reading the early church fathers. We've seen the way the church fathers lived, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, would you describe the post-Nicene Roman Catholic Church, post-Constantine Roman Catholic Church as more or less decadent than the early church fathers? More decadent. They had access to all the wealth of the empire, all the technology of the empire, all this stuff. Yeah, no. This started with Constantine, the Roman Catholic Church. Definitely.
Boom. This, of course, it's words. Well, think about it, right? Justin the Martyr could boast. Well, first of all, prior to Constantine, church fathers could boast to the emperor that no Christian had ever been accused or arrested for sedition against the state. Now, fast forward the next 1,700 years, who can say that? I mean, maybe the Amish?
Good point, yeah.
Okay, well, when did Christians start conspiring against the state, even other Christian states? Oh wait, it was Constantine. What do you know?
Have given it life in the past, until at some point it starts shedding and deconstructing necessary cultural apparatuses, and it begins its phase of decline. Here, Mencius Moldbug points to how, in Christian civilization, the initial Reformed Protestantism transformed into a socially progressive-minded Christian activism, then to a liberal progressive sentiment with no spiritual principles attached, and now finally to a progressive consensus that is obsessed with deconstructing and unwinding the very Christian civilization that gave it birth to begin with. A brief review of the reigning consensus of Harvard and Yale will tell this story very clearly. This is a tale as old.
Because obviously the Puritans who stoned adulterers are on par with transgender activists. But the other point is, I don't want to rehash everything when I did about 2 or 3 streams ago, the ultra-Calvinist argument. But we all know that this entire argument that Moldbug makes is entirely disingenuous and is to deflect attention away from the people Dave Chappelle calls they. Moving on.
Oldest time, and it is very much the same civilizational cycle that we hear talked about by Spengler, and of course by much older thinkers than him. But at this stage, since we are more or less done with the theory, perhaps we can return to our own contemporary society, to the contest between left and right, between red America and blue America, and see how Mencius Moldbug's theories helps us answer questions about this fundamental division that has created a rift in the West. What is the fundamental difference between the left and the right as they exist in politics today? Who is correct? And who, if any side, should we support? What is the left and the Democratic Party? They are the representatives of the true inner party of the Cathedral, the societal consensus. They are the force that drives progress and the direction of the nation and the civilization as a whole. What is the right and the Republican Party? They are the representatives of the outer party, the token resistance that plies the brakes to progress, that slows the course of history down, and disagrees with the main representatives of the cathedral in a way that is acceptable to the cathedral itself. They are the loyal opposition. And so, which of these two sides do we want to support? Well, the left, obviously, at least if you like winning, and everyone likes winning. After all, they are on the right side of history. They're going to be the side that gets all the glory for the new social reform when they finally and inevitably come to pass. They're the ones that are going to have the satisfaction of saying, "I told you so," when we finally bring down the oppressive concept of monogamy and the antiquated notions of nations having borders. And if you have no moral problems with the aforedescribed progress, then it really is quite a good deal if you plan for a career in politics. There will be rewards, psychologically at least.
So I think this last 15 minutes, the real relevant issue here is I think we just haven't got far enough in the Moldbug corpus, because a lot of what Dave is saying here is contingent upon reading Moldbug to be saying that technology is a moral hazard that people use to move left. I've been saying that for a long time. So far, I haven't seen Moldbug say it. That doesn't mean he won't. So in this respect, as we've gotten this far into Dave's presentation, I can't say whether I agree that that's an accurate reflection of Moldbug, because again, so far we haven't seen it, but we've only scratched the surface.
There is, of course, one small caveat, one small issue, and that is if you get the sneaking suspicion that our society, that our civilization is not in ordinary operating procedures, but is instead approaching the beginning of an accelerating, metastasizing decline and collapse. We may be on the cusp of that final step, the step where the left finally devours the essential social bonds for civilization, and then finally itself. In that case, assisting the left is only assisting in the hastening of your own doom and the destruction of yourself and your posterity. It's a possibility, but a remote one, right? Our current cultural leaders, our current governmental leaders have a handle on things. They certainly aren't going to pursue and allow any progressive moves, at least none that won't have ready technological solutions, or problems that can't be overcome by the increasing growth in wealth brought about by technology, right? And sure enough, maybe everything will work out. Perhaps universal basic income and wealth growth fueled by Silicon Valley will solve the problem of third world poverty and migration into the West. Perhaps robots and artificial intelligence will solve the problem of the decline of the family, the atomization of the individual, and the general loneliness of modern society. Perhaps cloning technology will solve the decline in birth rates, and machine-guided surgeries will solve the problem of transgenderism, to the point at least where no expert can tell between the biological women and the elective ones. I mean, we all have to decide whether this is going to happen or not. You either trust the technocrats who develop the cultural consensus of this society, or you don't. If you're a right-winger like me, then, for reasons either good or bad, you don't trust our current crop of leaders. But if you're on the progressive side of things...
The other thing Dave is going to say, if you're on the progressive side of things, then you will. But you won't, right? Because I know plenty of far-left people that don't trust the elites. For example, Derek Jensen doesn't trust the elites. Keith Preston doesn't trust the elites. And they're pretty far-left people. So that's another failure, I think, of this Moldbugian analysis is what do you do with these far left people that are critical in their own way of the cathedral?
Exactly.
Do they not exist?
Yeah, it's trying to collapse everything left toward the progressive left when there's all sorts of other left-wing movements that aren't progressive.
Yes.
Then in one way or the other, you probably do trust such men. We are headed straight for a techno-utopia, or perhaps even a singularity, and democratically elected technocrats are just the ticket to get us there. Of course, this decision, at the end of the day, has a certain amount of subjectivity to it. Everyone is going to decide for themselves who they're going to put their faith in. But before I move on to the last portion of this talk, and leave the decision up to the viewers, there is one more avenue I briefly want to examine before you cast your vote on whether our current societal trajectory is towards a utopia or towards total collapse. And this examination begins with looking at Robert Conquest's third law. Yes, the red-headed stepchild of the bunch that really nobody talks about. Law 1 and Law 2 look like commandments etched in historical stone, something that will be true now and true forever. But the third law just looks like complaint about bureaucrats. Pretty pedestrian. And it's not even really clear how it's related to the other two. Bureaucrats are inefficient. What a revelation. I never heard that one before. But when you stop to think about it, have we asked ourselves why? Mainstream conservatives like Ben Shapiro and William F. Buckley have answers to this question that are neat. Their answer is incentives. Bureaucrats are inefficient. They act like they're in a conspiracy against the institution because they don't have proper market incentives to act correctly. Corporations, they say, by contrast, do have proper market-based monetary incentives, and so their employees, at least, do not act like a conspiracy against the institution itself. But is this explanation true? Certainly, no one ever accuses the military of behaving this way, and it doesn't use market incentives. Furthermore, the mainstream conservatives' assertion that the employees of corporations do not act as a conspiracy against the company is really only true when we look at healthy companies. Companies that are solvent. Companies that are in their period of growth. Unhealthy corporations in impossible situations where their business model fundamentally fails do start to act just like Robert Conquest described bureaucracies. Their employees begin conspiring against the shareholders. Corporations exist for one reason: to pay off shareholders. They develop around some successful, prosperous business model and expand based on its success. But along the while, as they grow, corporations begin to change. The market shift, the founding leadership leaves and is replaced, and soon the organization has a new set of priorities that are not as strictly focused on shareholder value. And so the corporation loses focus and eventually goes into decline. And at some point, it becomes obvious to the management and to the employees that govern the company that the business model the company is based around is insolvent. And then suddenly, the incentives change. The priorities of the management stop being about delivering value to the shareholders in the long term, because the long term is futile. What matters is about getting out with what you have, looking out for number one, and to make sure that you're not the one who's holding the bag of.
That's actually the point that you and I made, right? Moldbug was saying that corporate decision-making doesn't have any flaws, and they never do these terrible things like hostile takeovers. Remember that we had like a couple episodes ago?
Yeah, I mean, Moldbug's entire shtick so far has been like, imagine American cities were ran like corporations.
So, I mean, okay, I agree with Dave on this, but it's weird that he's describing this to Moldbug, because Moldbug, from what we've read, says that doesn't happen. Right?
Yeah, he wants to expand the corporate model because it's so efficient.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, again, this is now Dave speaking, not Moldbug, so, but I don't think Moldbug's saying this.
Of shit when the music stops. And so, once decline is reached, management does become a conspiracy against the shareholders. And this very pattern is present inside governments and inside cathedrals. In many ways, it's useful to model both as corporations. Both governments and civilizations have shareholders, the citizens in the case of the government, and the general posterity of the people in the case of a civilization or a cathedral. Each also has assets and liabilities that it manages and manipulates to further the objectives of those stakeholders. And of course, when the institution, when the government, or when the civilization itself goes into terminal decline, those who are put in charge of managing those assets, who are in charge of the government or civilization or cultural property of a people, begin to stop acting in the interests of their stakeholders, begin to stop acting in the interests of the people, the citizens, or their posterity, and begin to act in their own interests. They begin to act in a mode of self-preservation, as a conspiracy against the very institution that gave them power. Perhaps Robert Conquest's third law is not as eternal as the first, but simply an observation about the current state of affairs, the transition of the leadership class in the West from a mode of delivering value to the people and their posterity to just another bureaucratic organization trying to manage the decline and get out of the door with their heads intact. And if this is the case, then indeed it is evidence that we are in the middle of a decline, potentially a metastasizing decline that will end in collapse. The music is slowing, and it may yet stop. But of course, again, this is somewhat subjective. We all have to decide how true it is that cultural, governmental, and educational leaders were more trustworthy and more interested in the people in previous eras of the West. I get the sense that people generally feel like this is the case, but there could be some nostalgic misremembering going on. Maybe there's nothing to worry about and we're on our way to utopia. But what if the music is slowing down, and what if we get the sense that the load won't bear, that we might be looking down the barrel of a governmental or civilizational collapse? This is the real red pill. And it comes along with a sort of sinking feeling when you realize the disaster that we might actually be staring at. But then I think a certain relief when we know what might be ahead and what we have to do to prepare for it. And so here we might segue to the very obvious secondary question of what is to be done. How do we head off or lessen the impacts of this terminal decline? In Moldbug's estimation, the only solution was a reset, a sort of civilizational bankruptcy where the old institutions could be cleared away, the old loyalties to government and reciprocal obligations could be upset and replaced with new forms of administration that would be more closely allied to providing value for the civilization and the country's main stakeholders, the citizens and their posterity. A sort of radical reorganization so that the original interests of the country, of the cultural institutions, can be reimagined, and something of the old can be restored. Now, as far-fetched and as vague as Moldbug is about this, it has a certain type of precedence, at least in corporate.
Because we have read a lot about the restructuring argument.
Yes.
And it has nothing to do about restoring traditions. The reason why Moldbug wants to reset is to just clearly define who owns what.
Yeah.
In fact, if the same people like, say, Elon Musk, or at the time Steve Jobs, who's now dead, or Bill Gates are still in charge, well, then that doesn't matter to Moldbug at all. It just matters that everything's clearly defined. Who owns what? So, and furthermore, the original stakeholders, let's call them heritage Americans, are not the people in charge of big tech. So they would not be the ones that would get a seat at the table. Now, given, was it the Optimate? I forget the other group, the red state rural folks, the OV, I think is what Moldbug calls them. The best they're going to get is a few dollars given to them by the government as a token that they're represented within the democratic system.
Right.
They're not going to be, their values aren't going to be restored. Now, of course, what this is Dave inserting his own values into Moldbug, but strictly speaking, that's not an introduction to Moldbug's thought. That's an introduction to Dave's thought.
Maybe so far. We still have years of his blog to get through.
Well, I mean, Moldbug flip-flops so many times, even in year one. I mean, does Moldbug believe in anything?
Well, that's a good question. We'll see.
Administration. Corporations that are no longer solvent, in the best case scenario, are liquidated and reconfigured so that their continued operation does not destroy and further injure the well-being of the stakeholders. One might also imagine something somewhat similar happening on a civilizational scale during the fall of the Roman Empire, as Rome's interests in the West became subsumed into various barbarian kingdoms, which, by taking charge of the empire in piecemeal, and by employing radically different organizational schemes better suited for the times, were, with a very, very long lead time, able to restore many of the same civilizational objectives as the original empire. Mencius Moldbug talks briefly about the kind of solution he'd like to implement, and to take a cursory glance, what Moldbug imagines is the combination of two ideas, neo-cameralism and patchwork. Neo-cameralism, being based off the original German cameralism, is the idea that the state is operated centrally and for the express purpose of its shareholders. Patchwork, a somewhat newfangled concept, is the idea of a decentralized collection of mini-states, each with enforced peace treaties and freedom of movement, a mixture of mini-corporate states from which anyone can emigrate. In short, Mencius Moldbug imagines a system in patchwork that is 100% choice and 0% voice when it comes to choosing a government. Now, many people consider the prescriptive dimension of Moldbug's theories to be the weakest and vaguest, and I'm certainly in agreement here. But I will note that most people who understand that we are in the process of decline and that radical reform is needed oftentimes vaguely allude to some kind of radical reorganization, though usually not nearly in as many words as Mencius Moldbug himself. What I think is more important, however, than the specific form of the reorganization is discussing how it can be achieved and lobbied for in the present system. If we do sense a decline is coming, if we do know that a reorganization is needed, and that the sooner this reorganization comes before the decline reaches its zenith, the better, then we are immediately confronted with how we achieve this objective. And here once more, I think Mencius Moldbug's ideas are quite useful. We can start with what doesn't work. Perhaps what is most immediately obvious to anyone who's listened to this video thus far, what does not work is mainstream Republican politics.
Can you pause this real quick,
This
Dave?
is, of course, futile.
We also know what does not work. Monarchy. The Romanovs, the Stuarts, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, all were destroyed in a fiery conflagration. We all know that doesn't work, but apparently we've chosen to forget that.
We also know that corporate power doesn't seem to work very well. I mean, look at what Twitter's going through right now. Corporates are supposed to be individual, solvent institutions that, give value to shareholders. But with all the leaks that have happened since Elon's taken over last night, I mean, Twitter was basically conspiring with government actors in a way that would, one would think, undermine the confidence of their shareholders, because it was no longer a neutral platform. It was a very politicized one. I mean, look at the Gillette commercial, look at all the stuff that corporations have been doing these days. I mean, there's no guarantee that arranging things like a corporation is going to be of any more help either.
Well, and they also, for being uber efficient, they seem to need a lot of bailouts.
That's a good point.
And is futile by its very description. The point of mainstream conservative politics, the point of the Republican Party, is to operate as an acceptable opposition inside of the consensus, inside of the cathedral. It cannot itself be used to critique elements of that cathedral that have gone wrong. It's not within its nature. And if one attempts to bring hard reactionary, hard anti-establishment views into mainstream conservative circles, you may find that your fellow right-wingers are fighting you harder than they are the progressive opposition. Of course, this failure is well known to anyone in the contemporary dissident right. But just to head off another failed strategy, and a strategy that is very commonly discussed in lieu of political failures, it is also entirely futile to try to organize some right-wing militia movement, or to try to take actions in order to instigate a civil war, or an armed conflict against the cathedral and the societal consensus itself. Aside, first of all, being almost an impossible conflict, fighting against the most powerful military force this planet has ever known, and a popular consensus that will...
In light of last year, and Kabul has not aged well.
Yeah, basically.
Keep going.
Will probably carry the day insofar as it comes down to the average citizen. Our current cultural consensus, the present-day cathedral, has historically defined itself in opposition to right-wing militarized movements. What is the personification of evil? Well, obviously the Third Reich. What is the story about the salvation of America? Well, obviously the Civil War. In both cases, the villains are armed right-wingers, and any attempt to replicate this will be put down quite easily. The path to victory in this dimension has been totally cut off, both culturally and institutionally, and those who pursue it are pursuing futility. We shouldn't be looking in this direction for a solution, at least if we like winning. Instead, what Moldbug imagined as a solution, he termed pacifism. No, not the refusal to engage in war, but rather the refusal to engage with the political power structure as it exists, to essentially play a passive game against the cathedral. Elements of rebellion and revolution are not avenues that are open to people trying to fix things from the right. They are denied by the cathedral, and complaining that, well, the left can get away with it really isn't going to help. That would be like a pirate complaining once he is caught that state-sanctioned privateers were guilty of the same crimes he was. They were authorized, and in this case the left is authorized for revolution, and the right is not. Activism, passive resistance, and open revolution that are very loud work on the left because they are operating with the cathedral, with the cultural consensus that exists in our civilization as a whole. People like Gandhi and Martin Luther King were able to succeed largely because they had sponsors and sympathizers inside the intelligentsia and the cultural elite of the West. And the same thing goes for Marxist, communist, socialist, and left anarchist revolutions as they existed in the past and today. I don't need to remark on the relative acceptability difference between the Communist Party and the modern formation of Nazi parties, even though they both have somewhat similar body counts. Instead, if we're interested in change from the right, in change against the direction of decline, we have to think differently about what can be accomplished under the current constraints. We have to play a passive game of building alternatives. For Moldbug, this starts with building an alternative to the cathedral itself, starting with the most fundamental unit of cultural consensus, the academy. Moldbug imagines an alternative to the university forming, a type of anti-versity, as he calls it, which operates under different principles, pursues areas of academic exploration that are shunned by the contemporary ideologies that reign inside the cathedral's consensus.
We did talk about this last week, in part with his programming screed, but the idea is he just wants education privatized. I mean, he literally says time and time again that there's no profitability to these progressive ideas. So the only reason why they're being taught is they're being propped up by government money. If we got rid of the government money and then presumably had corporate money, well, that aged like crap because look at what the corporate money's behind.
Right. And I mean, they're trying like alternate university systems. They're starting that thing in Texas, Bogosian and the IDW folks or whatever, and they're getting absolutely crapped on too by the Cathedral. Homeschooling, for example, is becoming more and more socially shunned. I saw a Twitter thread on homeschooling, and it was just a bunch of like progressives with their heads in their rears calling homeschoolers a bunch of like Christian bigots and idiots, and look at all these people without any formal training and education trying to educate their kids. Like, if you want to talk about avenues not open because of what the Cathedral says, I mean, this is increasingly just another one. So if you're gonna let your enemy define what your revolution looks like, you might as well just go home now.
Well, that's actually the whole problem with this frame game here, right? Again, when Dave referred back to notice the argument that he gave against violent conflict. Not that it was immoral per se, but that it wouldn't work under the current system because of the way the Cathedral is organized. But here's the thing: you're playing within the Cathedral's frame, and as Sun Tzu said, if you play within the enemy's rules of engagement, you will lose because they're setting the terms. You have to change the terms. The best example I can come up with, the easiest one to understand, is the American Revolution. The British had the lining column, so you march up, you start blasting each other with muskets, and then the battle's over. The Americans are like, we can't compete at that level. So what we're going to do is we're going to use sharpshooters, we're going to use hit and run tactics. We're gonna make the British scratch their heads and wear them out. So what you don't do is you don't fall into their frame.
Exactly.
And through this process, begin to form up communities of learning, communities of knowledge that are respected, that are trusted, and that can create a beacon for people to rally around if our current cultural consensus goes wrong.
Well, hold on. If the current cultural consensus goes wrong, then anything goes, because the entire argument against the militias was that they're not solid under the consensus.
Yeah.
So if it's going to take the current consensus going belly up to make this work, then why wouldn't that work for all the other arguments? What the hell?
It would. That's the problem.
Right. And this whole idea of, well, these are institutions we can trust just in case the consensus. Well, look, the consensus doesn't trust anybody but itself. That's obvious. Like, look at COVID, for example, right? You had one of the most published doctors, cardiologists of all time saying, look, as a cardiologist, I'm looking at what this vaccine's doing and I'm terrified, right? And he's writing papers about it. He's trying to communicate to people about it. You can't find somebody more credentialed within the system who's trying to break away from the system than somebody like that guy. One of the co-inventors of the mRNA technology. All sorts of people from high up in the institutions are basically trying to start a parallel institution, and they're getting attacked at every turn by the Cathedral. Never mind the fact they more than earn their stripes within the system. The second they try to break out of it, well, these are just quacks. You can't listen to them, even though we'd have told you to listen to them a year ago because of how published they were. Like, this doesn't make any sense.
No, and that's because the framing of Moldbug doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It is important that this process goes on, in opposition to the consensus, but no means directly confronting it, never trying to contest directly for power against a much more powerful foe. But from this, the seeds of a reactionary movement might be formed, something that can hold back and process a decline, an alternative that might be the salvation of our civilization, and maybe even the human race. Indeed, when I think of Mencius Moldbug's talk of the antiversity, I immediately think back to the fall of the Roman Empire and the role that the nascent Catholic Church played, both in creating a counter-narrative to the Roman bureaucracy and also being the new seeds of learning during the medieval era of European history. I think it still remains to be seen how much something like this is possible in the modern information era. But as authors like Rodriher have speculated when talking about the Benedict option, something like this is very obviously needed. So, after processing this part of Mencius Moldbug's ideas, in his ruminations on his blog, Unqualified Reservations, where does this leave us? Well, I think at least with a new perspective on things. A foundation for the ideas that most people now call neo-reactionary. In many ways, neo-reactionaries, people who follow Moldbugian ideas or Moldbugian-like ideas, are preparing for the worst. But in another very distinct way, reactionaries oftentimes can tap into an inner calm. They're staring into the worst possibilities, and they know that they can, in part, hedge against it. Like most right-wing labels, reactionary is something that has been created by the enemies of the right. The main point of the title, when used in a modern sense, is to distinguish a reactionary from a mainstream conservative. Reactionaries do not want to slow things down. They do not want to stop history or go backwards to some previous golden age. They just believe that society needs, desperately, a different direction to go forward. If in any way the reactionary can said to be reacting to something, he is reacting to the manifest ruin that will be brought about as the result of the consensus's view of progress and the general direction of society. But in everything we associate with the label reactionary, I think there is one thing that a reactionary cannot be, and that is simply reactive. The point of neo-reactionary ideas is to anticipate decline, to build and cultivate alternatives, to make oneself worthy of power, and then, when necessary, take the appropriate action to secure it. Here is where we are left by Mencius Moldbug, agree or disagree. For those who are facing down the modern problems in the West, we must take the next step, find what works and what doesn't, and what models can be best used to forge something better for our posterity, regardless of what dreams or nightmares the future has in store once we have swallowed the red pill.
Okay, so that's the end of that. So really two parts here. All the stuff that was covered, that was Moldbug that we covered, I still disagree with for the very same reasons I did before. The stuff about technology, I can't say because I haven't got to that part in Moldbug yet. If Moldbug says that, good for him. But that's all I can say right now. Logos?
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, listening to that take, I can see if this is what Dave got from Moldbug, why Dave would like Moldbug. I haven't heard Moldbug say a lot of this yet. I mean, in fact, if very little of what we've read of Moldbug is actually in that video, so we'll have to see.
Mhm.
We'll have to see what happens. Moldbug right now doesn't strike me as a guy that's going hard after technology. In fact, Moldbug strikes me as a guy that wants to use techno lingo to describe everything. Everything's a programming process. Society can be engineered,
Mm-hmm.
which requires a very, very high level of technology to pull off. But if technology inevitably veers society left, how are you going to get the technology to engineer society while stopping it from driving off the leftward cliff? I mean, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Near the end of the video, where Dave gets back on the framing that we do know from Moldbug, we have seen from Moldbug, he starts making sense in the characteristic way Moldbug never makes sense. Certain things can't work because the cathedral won't allow them, so let's do this other thing that the cathedral won't allow, just in case the cathedral falls apart. It'll work, guys. Trust me.
Yeah.
So I don't know if anybody else has any other videos or sources of people that are getting something from Moldbug. We'll look at them from time to time, but I guess in our usual time left, we might translate back into looking at articles or something.
Yeah, we will, but I want to make one other point. The one thing that was conspicuous by its absence was the entire point of unqualified reservations.
That's a good point. I was going to say that and I forgot.
The entire point of unqualified reservations was to make the de jure distinctions of power the same as the de facto. And as long as there's ambiguity there, which he presumes, he's arguing a corporation eliminates that ambiguity, which it doesn't. But because again, going back to the very first article, he's like, we need to have things clearly defined. It's called formalism. That didn't come up at all in this discussion. That was what was really bizarre to me, because that was the whole point of all of unqualified reservations.
Right. To clarify, we're not talking about Dave's view of technology. We're talking about Moldbug's view of technology. We're saying that Moldbug has this view that you can engineer society. He uses all the programming lingo and so on.
Right. Yes. That's from what we've read, and
so
we're
far from
comparing that to
Moldbug.
what we've heard from Dave tonight.
Exactly. So I don't think I'm trying to characterize Dave's view on technology. I don't even know what that is. We're talking about Dave insofar as we think he's trying to characterize Moldbug, and we're a bit confused on that because it seems contrary to what we've seen Moldbug say so far.
Yes, that's all we're saying. And again, mixed opinions. I mean, I think we just need to read more Moldbug to see if this is a legitimate compilation. So, yeah, we'll go through some more. These aren't, at least this one here isn't too long. The Pigeon.
Looks like another poem thing. Yeah.
Oh, that's a pigeon. Yeah, we'll skip it. No more poems. Ah, boy. Let's see here. This might be all we do tonight. Universalism, post-war progressivism as a Christian sect. More of this crap, huh, Logos? July 17th, 2007. Apparently, there was once a kind of obsolete proto-blog that was called a book. A book was like the blog, except that the author saved up all his posts for a year or two, then dumped them all in one big printout. This product cost thousands of microcredits, and you had to apply to the Department of Facts if you wanted to write one. And even if Facts stamped your party card, you still had to convince information to promote you, and those who excelled at this gloriously opaque task tended to make Tyrrell look like Montague. While this sucked really such as much as it sounds, it did have certain advantages. One of them was that your readers were presented with a crisp and structured argument rather than a great river of instant manure whose color and consistency can vary alarmingly. This was because the book could be revised and edited practices we now consider unethical. Well, Logos, that is strangely self-aware of Moldbug. Wouldn't you say? You're muted, Logos. Well, let's. Oh, never mind. Never mind. And rightly so, of course. We don't want to return to the past. No one wants that. Let's see here. I'll look at the chat. Logos had to go AFK a moment. I want to get his takes on this. Let's engage with the chat a little bit till he gets back. A lot of chat today. Cyberpunk Internal Affairs. I've picked up the phone. Praise of Folius. Transport me out of the Matrix. There we go. Cyber Ninja Zero. Ready for another banger episode? I hope so. Minoa, in 20 hours on Moldbug. I'm guessing we're better read on Moldbug at this point than 90% of the NRX. Yeah, I think so too. So that's interesting. Okay, some small talk here. What else we got? I see we have King Samuel's Fish showed up. Not in this fit, though. Holiday Hellux. I remember the early British years where the invasion of Afghanistan was considered the kryptonite of the left. Yeah, it was. Considered that. Let's see here. Charlemagne. Moldbug pretends progress is emergent and that there are no planners because the planners are on his side. Probably a reference to the Hobbits and Elves essay, but yeah. Sure. Charlemagne, the left-wing force is literally planned. 1789, anyone? Yeah, exactly. Let's see. Hajo Hariri, leftism is dependent on technological progress. Isn't this obvious? Of course, collapse would make human organization more conservative again. But Western wealth is a given in this analysis. Yeah, we need that too. I mean, it's the wealth that makes all this possible. Paul von Hindenburg, control of surplus is the basis of class. Yeah, I can see that. Spaz, he who believes in nothing stands for anything. Yeah, that too. Debt or wait. Okay, I see. Just more left of. That's kind of funny. What else we got? Okay. So, Logos, where do you want me to pick up reading again? Where did you last hear?
Right as you got to the article, sorry, I had to run off. I've been dealing with some really terrible allergies all of a sudden, and I had to blow my nose and do some things. Yeah, just if you just summarize real quick what you've read so far, I'll believe you.
All Moldbug said is that, you know, a book is like a very long blog, all released at once. Because unlike blogs, which are just a bunch of diarrhea and crap, a book is all put together and edited. And I'm like, that's very self-aware of Moldbug.
I think one interesting difference between a book and a blog is because blogs are periodically written. The author is able to update their views over time and give like snapshots as things change. Whereas a book is very crystallized. It's a really, really big project that you have to publish all at once. And you just have to hope that that book is representative of your views then and into the near future.
Yes. And rightly so, of course. We don't want to return to the past. No one wants that. However, if you write online and you want to speak with any kind of confidence, you have to be able to change your mind. Ideally, this is not done by superstitiously editing the archives as if one were writing a book. As UR readers have been reminded ad nauseum, one of many eccentric opinions is that the tradition to which most sophisticated Westerners of 2007 conform is that has been a secret sect of Christianity. Since the tradition itself seems as a pure product of science and reason, neither sectarian nor Christian or even traditional, my perspective is heretical in the strict sense of the word. We can't both be right. My argument is that through the tradition is theologically atrophied, its moral and political positions and its personal and institutional patterns of transmission, identified as the legitimate modern successor to mainline Protestantism, which, as Logos and I have already discussed, is complete garbage. Moldbug is deflecting from other people. Since this is only the most powerful branch of Christianity and the most powerful nation on the planet, since it's swallowing its claims of denying innocence is a little difficult for me. Well, see, that doesn't make sense, right? How can Protestantism be the most powerful branch of Christianity when half the Supreme Court is Catholic?
Exactly. Yep.
I mean, he's the one that always talks about government power trumping corporate power. Well,
Well,
there
yeah,
you go.
but he also does say that the judiciary really doesn't have a lot of power. The judiciary is like weak and whatever. He's putting all the power in the hands of like the professoriate, the media, and so on. And he thinks that the quote New England Protestant consensus is informing all of this.
Well, let's just say in light of the comedy kangs, it's not the Protestants that run the media. This heresy implies a substantial qualitative revision of reality as we know it. For example, Richard Dawkins considers himself a follower of something called Einsteinian religion, which appears to differ not at all from the aforementioned tradition. From Dawkins' perspective, he is defending reason against superstition. From my perspective, he is prosecuting one Christian sect on behalf of another. It's simply unrealistic to expect to be able to make this revision or even evaluate it fairly without adjusting the language we use to frame the problem. To this end, I've field tested several neologisms such as ultra-Calvinism and crypto-Calvinism, and also satisfied myself that existing names such as liberalism are just as useless and confusing as they seem. Well, because the first two are completely made-up nonsense terms, so of course they're confusing. And liberalism, unfortunately, is an evolving term. So the liberal of, like, say, John Stuart Mill may not be the same of FDR, which may not be the same as Barack Obama.
Right.
The problem with the neologism is that they just prejudice the argument. It's impossible to make them non-pejorative. Perhaps this tradition to be named is a blow us of ancient benighted lies, and perhaps its followers are either deluded zombies or unprincipled opportunists who need to be stopped. But the whole point of naming it is to synthesize a red pill that we can feed to the former, and no such pill has any reason to be bitter. So I've decided I like the name Universalism with a capital U. Because remember, Logos, Calvinist theology teaches that everybody gets saved. Just saying. Just
Absolutely. That. Yep.
Most universalists would accept this name as an improper noun because, after all, they consider their beliefs universal. That is, they think everyone should share them, and eventually everyone will. So all they have to swallow is the capital letter. It goes down easily with a sip of water, dissolves quickly in any hot beverage, can be crushed and mixed with applesauce, etc. Universalism is the faith of the ruling class, the Brahmins. It's best seen as a victory creed of World War II, and it's easy to connect to the various international institutions born in that victory, which universalists still regard as a sacred if occasionally stained by human frailty, much as intelligent Catholics see the Roman Catholic Church. It's not a coincidence that Catholic and Universal are synonymous. Well, wait a minute now. Is he saying that, like, Catholics are ultra-Calvinists now?
I don't know, man.
I mean, right? Is that what he's saying? Universalism is actually already the name of a Christian doctrine, the doctrine of universal salvation. This idea that all dogs go to heaven and there's no hell is best regarded as an extremist mutation of Calvinism. Whoa. No, that's like the opposite of Calvinism. The Calvinism in its most extreme form says that God chooses some people to go to hell. That's what extreme Calvinism is, in which everyone is part of the elect. The modern idea of universal salvation comes to us from Unitarian thinkers such as Emerson and forms the second half of UUism, whose devotees are, needless to say, universalists to perfection. It's an interesting exercise to compare the tenets of UUism to those of political correctness. Okay, brief church history here. The doctrine of universal salvation, as it exists within the Christian tradition, is first articulated by Origen, then, I believe, Gregory of Nyssa, and then some Orthodox theologian from Syria in the Middle Ages. I can't think of his name. And it's the universal, hold on a second, universal salvation of all things. There's a special Greek word for this. I want to look up things. Come on. There we go. Yeah, so we got Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, yeah. Isaac of Nineveh. He was the other one. Okay. Those are the three. By the way, none of them were Calvinists because it didn't exist yet. So moving on. The Universalist thesis united two American traditions that in the past had sometimes been at odds. One was the ecumenical mainline Protestant movement, exemplified by institutions such as the Federal Council of Churches, whose most daring theologians were moving toward humanism. The other was what might, with homage to Edward Bellamy, be called the nationalist movement, a vast raft of secular, pragmatists, socialists, anarchists, communists, and other reformers who flocked to the German-inspired university system that developed in the 19th century, becoming a sort of roach motel for bad ideas. Wait, Logos, wait a minute. So universalism is nationalism.
Wait, say that again?
Well, according to Moldbug, universalism is nationalism. The other was what might be, with homage to Edward Bellamy, called the nationalist movement. How are universalists nationalists?
Yeah, because nationalists love them open borders, Todd.
And how are socialists, anarchists, and communist nationalists? I mean, who staffs the ranks of Antifa?
Exactly. Like,
what is this?
See, we go from Dave's lucid video back into the trenches, man. It's like, let's take another fresh coat of paint. Let's take another look at Moldbug. You know, Dave found some good things to say about him. Let's just give it a go. And immediately we get this.
It's complete. Well, you know what? He said it. Right at the top. He said, rather than a great river of instant manure whose color and consistency can vary alarmingly. That sounds like what we've been reading, huh?
Yeah. I don't know, man. This is just...
I know. One of the most sensible nationalist philosophers, William James, seriously proposed paramilitary forced labor as a cure for the social ills in 1906. Oh, Billy, if only you knew. And the utopia of Bellamy's enormously influential looking backward, 1888, is essentially the Soviet Union. While these groups had generally cooperated into the progressive era, there were tensions, for example, over prohibition, where the secular nationalists found hard to swallow. These eased substantially in the New Deal, largely due to the brilliant coup in which progressives captured the Democratic Party, their former opposition, and converted it into an extremist progressive movement while repealing prohibition. Okay. Let's. FDR even had a book called Looking Forward printed under his name. Okay. This is the problem here. The progressives already were in control of the Democratic Party before prohibition. In fact, that's how they got prohibition in. Woodrow Wilson was, wait for it, even by Moldbug's terms, a progressive. So he's not even getting his history right. Interestingly, both the mainline Protestant and secular nationalist movements have deep links to the evil John Calvin, Ayatollah of Geneva. Mainline Protestants descend from Calvin through, of course, the Puritans. The nationalists were strongly influenced by this tradition as well. Because, of course, non-Trinitarianism, Unitarianism, and the idea that everybody gets saved are Calvinist doctrines. So, sure.
And the idea that we should be a global community, peace, love, and all, and open borders is the staple of nationalism.
That too, apparently. The
Apparently.
nationalists were strongly influenced by this tradition as well in its later Unitarian transcendentalist forms, but many also studied in the Prussian university system, where they learned the secular version of Calvin's divine state propounded by Genevan Rousseau and later by Hegel. Death is a master from Germany. Oh, hold up. Moldbug wants neo-cameralism, which is a product of the Prussian university.
Right.
What the heck is that?
I have no idea.
I mean, obviously it can't be that bad if he's going to adopt neo-cameralism.
Moldbug hyper-Calvinist confirmed.
Apparently hyper-Calvinism, crypto-Calvinism is formalist, apparently.
Schrodinger's formalist. We just don't know yet.
Schrodinger's formalism. After World War II, there was no longer any viable quarrel between these factions. That's not true at all.
Wait, what?
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 Okay, even if we accept this muddled nonsense from Moldbug, the new atheists would, in fact, remember this. Sam Harris said he preferred a fundamentalist to a progressive Christian because he knew the fundamentalist wasn't lying to him.
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah.
He said that.
And then also, right, most now call it transnationalism. Like transnationalism and nationalism are not the same thing. They definitely have beef. They're absolute opposites. What is this?
No. You know what transnationalism is? It's a collectivist Marxist who identifies as a nationalist.
Oh, of course.
Right? Any views which contradict universalism become socially unacceptable in polite society. Progressive Christianity through secular theologians such as Harvey Cox abandoned the last shreds of biblical theology and completed the long transformation into mere socialism. Nationalism also becomes an inappropriate term with regard to growth, and as with the growth in American power, it morphed into internationalism, and as most now call it transnationalism. Instead of sacralizing regional governments, transnationalists want to build a sacralized planetary government on the principle that, as Albert J. Nock put it, if a spoonful of prussic acid will kill you, a bottle full is just what you need to do a great deal of good. Creedal declarations of universalism. By the way, for a guy that's like simping and shilling for big corporations, he's really one to talk about global governance.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, what do you think Google wanted when it got started? Wants now. Creedal declarations of universalism are not hard to find. I am fond of the Humanist Manifesto. Boo. Oh, and no, that's okay. He's saying that's an accurate description of it. That was, I can't remember who did that. It was from like the 30s, which pretty much says it all. The UN Declaration of Human Rights is good as well. No mainline Protestant will find anything morally objectionable in any of these documents. In a probably vain attempt to boil down all this cant, I've defined the four principles ideals as the creative social justice, peace, equality, community. Yeah, like we've already read this. Where the crap does Calvin say any of this? Nowhere.
I mean, yeah, that sounds very, very close to liberty, equality, fraternity, which is in Catholic France.
Well, let's not forget, social justice was invented as a term by Catholic Jesuits. So again, that's a direct connection. I'm not making that up, right?
Right.
That's a literal direct connection. So again, I don't know why Moldbug can't do this.
I don't know why he's picking out the Protestants specifically. He hasn't made that clear. There's so much of church history to comb through. It looks like he's picked this one point arbitrarily and said, this is it.
I mean, given that he had such a difficult time in school, as we read from that last week, maybe some Calvinist chick dumped him.
Wow.
I mean, isn't that a thing Moldbug would do?
I'm not going to speculate on that.
Okay. Let's see. As we've seen, social justice means political violence and peace means victory. Both of those were terrible articles. You can go back and watch our earlier episodes and we dealt with them. We'll get into equality and community shortly. The latest chapter in this sad and savage story was written in the 1960s when the first post-war generation came of age. These young men and women had been educated by the universalist establishment which won the war and were quite unaware that any serious, intelligent person could disagree with the universalist consensus. The result was a sort of creeping Talibanization in which the doctrines of universalism became constantly more extreme, a process that continues to this day. Notice here, right, this is a perfect point to bring in technology, but he still doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Today, perhaps the simplest definition of universalism is that it's the belief system taught in America's universities, at least federally funded universities, but again, it's fundamentally a Christian sect, and its moral and political tenets will find echoes in Massachusetts and upstate New York at any time since the 1860s. Hawthorne's Blithedale Romance, for example, is a satire of hippies written in 1852. All that is missing is the Patchakuli. Well, I mean, okay, we could just say, well, this all goes back to Renaissance Catholic authors. We've got Thomas More's Utopia, which is socialism. Lenin, the Marxist historian Kautsky references More as one of the first socialists of the modern age. Lenin builds a statue in his honor. We also have Campanella, the City of the Sun. We have the Jesuits trying this out in Paraguay. I mean, these are all direct connections that one could make with a good deal more veracity than that, Cotton Mather gave us purple-haired lesbians. So, Universalist as a descendant of... Okay, this is the real connection. I mentioned this before. It's post-millennialism. That's what he's... But again, Orthodox and Catholics are post-millennial too. So I don't know why, for example, read Eusebius. He's post-millennial. I don't know why he does include them though, right? In this really weird backhanded way, he says that universalism is Protestant, but then Catholic means universal. So the RCC is universalist. What even is he talking about, Logos?
I've been confused the whole time. I hope you don't expect me to answer that question honestly.
Okay. Universalists, as descendants of Calvin's post-millennial eschatology, are in the business of building God's kingdom on earth. The original post-millennialists believed that once this kingdom was built, Christ would return, a theological spandrel long since discarded. The City on a Hill version is continuous tradition from John Winthrop to Barack Obama. In Britain, the closely related evangelical movement uses the term New Jerusalem, which I'm afraid never really made it across the pond, but expressed the vision perhaps best of all. I will always picture the New Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land as involving a lot of enormous concrete tower blocks with clashes, guns of Brixton playing somewhere on someone's ghetto blaster and a 40-year-old grandmother screaming at her junkie daughter, but I'm not sure this is how they saw it in the 1890s. What's really impressive about universalism is the way in which the messianic teenage fantasy power trip has attracted and continues to attract so many people who don't believe at all in the spirit world, only smoke weed on the weekends and think of themselves as sensible and down to earth. Of course, the belief that all universalist ideals can be justified by reason alone is a necessary condition, but Christian apologists have been deriving Christianity from pure reason since St. Augustine. You don't think these supposedly skeptical thinkers would be a little more skeptical? Well, again, that's just not a fair construction of Augustine. Augustine believed that you could rationally justify Christian belief, but that's far from saying that you could come to faith by reason alone. In fact, the tradition that Augustine represents would deny that. And so would Calvinists. As a non-universalist, I cannot help but admire the success of this particular replicator. It is brilliant design like the smallpox virus. The fact that no one actually designed it, Logos, this just developed naturally, right? No one designed this.
Yeah, nobody.
Any more than someone designed the smallpox virus. This is simply the result of adaptive selection in a highly competitive environment, heightens rather than detracts from my awe. The coolest thing about universalism is it has the perfect opposition. If a Christian who believes his or her faith is justified by universal reason is a universalist, a Christian who believes his or her faith is justified by divine revelation is, in other words, a Christian. As the word is commonly used today, might be called a revelationist. Suppose you have two faiths. Both claim to be absolutely and unbeatably true. Faith A tells you it is an inelucutable consequence of reason. Faith B tells you it is the literal word of God, which is more likely to be accurate. The answer is that you have no information at all. Perhaps faith B is the literal word of God, but you have no way to distinguish it from something that someone just made up. Perhaps faith A can be derived from pure reason, but you have no way to know if the derivation is accurate unless you work through it yourself, in which case, why do you need faith A? In fact, of the two, faith A is almost certainly more powerful and dangerous. As anyone who's majored in Marxist-Leninist studies knows, it's very easy to construct an edifice of pseudo-reason so vast and daunting that working through it is quite impractical. And the edifice is much more free to contradict common sense. In fact, it has an incentive to do so because nonsensical results are especially subtle and hard to follow. Well, I think this is obviously false. He says, in fact, of the two, A is more powerful and dangerous. Not just like a new atheist here, but who won in Afghanistan in the 80s? It was the Mujahideen, who believed that they were fighting for the word of God. It wasn't the pseudo-intellectual Marxists. So even within the time frame of this blog, this doesn't make sense. Would you agree, Logos?
Well, I'm confused. Doesn't he say faith A is almost certainly more powerful and dangerous? Sorry, maybe I missed it. What was faith A?
The rationally derived rather than the word of God.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, you need the word of God. That's the more dangerous one.
Well, because who won? The communists or the Mujahideen? The Mujahideen won.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
Because they believed in the word of God. And of course, the Taliban believed in the word of God and beat the United States. Now, I'm not saying that the Islam is true, but if that's your belief system that's motivating your behavior, then you're going to win every single time against these pseudo-intellectuals like Marxists and capitalists.
Well, yeah, the way I'd put it succinctly goes like this. Rationally derived beliefs can give you something to live for, but only the word of God or something similar can give you something to die for.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so we did that. Let's keep going. Whereas when the word of God contradicts common sense, the idea that it might not actually be the word of God isn't too hard to come by. In other words, if faith A contains any fallacies, there are especially camouflage, whereas the and God says step and faith B syllogisms are clearly marked and brightly colored, and faith B pays a price in skepticism if God's opinion is obviously at variance with physical reality. Well, again, Moldbug. In 1989, when the Mujahideen won, how come they didn't have to pay that price? I mean, who was at variance with physical reality, the communists or the Mujahideen, Moldbug? Well, given that the alt-right says war is the highest struggle, Mussolini said it's the highest good. Deus Vult, right? Apparently, faith in God wins. So a reasonable observer might guess that, in fact, the tenets of faith B are more likely to be true simply because it's more difficult for them to get away with being false. But in reality, these derivations tell us nothing. Probably faith A is right about some things and faith B is right about some others. However, in the struggle between universalism and revelationism, the former always wins. No, it doesn't. Who won in Afghanistan in the 80s? The quote, revelationists who believe that this is the word of God. Give me a break, Moldbug. Because the universalists control the mainstream education information system, this is really not at all surprising. But since, as we've seen, it is not rational for reasonable observers to choose justification by any reason over justification by revelation, a political system in which the universalists are the globetrotters and the revelationists are the generals is almost certain to be one which systematically propagates lies. We've already seen a few of these lies, and we'll see quite a few more. However, I think the dynamics of the struggle are better illustrated by the questions in which, by whatever coincidence, the universalists are right and the revelationists are wrong. For example, because my zip code is 94114, although I am straight as an iron spear, I happen to see nothing wrong with my gay marriage. In fact, I'm completely sympathetic to the universalist view, in which the fact that couples have to be of opposite sex is sort of a bizarre holdover from the Middle Ages, like the ducking stool or trial by fire. Okay, it is not clear to me why homosexuality, which obviously has some extremely concrete biological cause, is so common in modern Western populations, because it is what it is. Again, a perfect place to bring up technology. He doesn't do it. Anything you want to add to that, Logos?
Nope.
Okay. However, because I am straight, etc., and because I'm not a universalist, I happen to think this issue is not really one of the most pressing concerns facing humanity. And so it occurs to wonder to me how exactly gay marriage became an issue when no one 20 years ago even thought of it as a possibility. So that would be 1987. Whatever the forces that brought us here, I find it hard to imagine anyone describing it as democratic with a straight face. If anyone can come up with an example of a way in which the American public opinion has changed in this way, where the change has gone against the universalists and in favor of the revolutionists, I would certainly be interested to hear it. Well, I can think of one off the top of my head that's really easy. Second Amendment. That's still strong as ever right now as far as national support. Even the Supreme Court recently, in the last few years, has ruled in cases in favor of it.
Well, I think public opinion on the Second Amendment has remained strong, but I think he's looking for like a rightward change.
Oh, like a pivot against
Yes.
some sort of yeah, okay. Well, in that regard, in public opinion, we haven't seen that yet.
I don't think we're going to.
Not until things start breaking down, we won't.
Yep.
I think there are a few let's see. I think there are a few exceptions, notably in the domain of economics, but they all seem to involve an extremely dramatic intrusion of reality, a force which rarely has any direct impact on American opinion. Okay, I mean, more gobbledygook. I don't know what to make of all this. Do you, Logos?
No, I don't think I've understood a single thing he said this entire post, to be honest.
Okay, this one's so short, we'll knock it out and then we'll wrap it up. Administravia, July 18th, 2007. One posting will be limited for the next couple of weeks as I'm traveling. Readers should also expect limited responsiveness in the comment section. Oh, this is just...
Yeah.
You can skip this. Yeah, this is nothing.
Bookkeeping.
Okay, we're not going to do this. It's really long. So...
Right.
Okay. As I told you before, the stream was even live, Logos. Whatever one might want to say about Dave, at least in that video, Dave had a coherent arc. Whether you agreed with it, whether you agreed it was an accurate reproduction of Moldbug. Moldbug, you can spend 40 minutes and not get anywhere.
Yeah.
It's
you get a
insane.
headache. You get a headache. You get that. I got a headache right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I don't know. I mean, look, I don't know how you find a meaning in Moldbug. Look, I don't know where Dave is getting this. I mean, he got it from somewhere, so maybe we just have to read more. But I don't know where you get a coherent narrative out of Moldbug.
Maybe in his later writings, but I have a feeling I'll be saying that every week for a while.
You will be saying that for a while. But yeah, again, everybody, if you want to recommend any other introductions to Moldbug that we could watch, we'll do that to break up the monotony of reading. Well, let me quote Moldbug to say what we're reading. Instead of reading a great river of manure whose color and consistency can vary alarmingly. Instead of that. So, I don't know. Is there anything you want to end with before we wrap this up, Logos?
No, Dave seemed to pull a bunch of lucid stuff out of Moldbug. I hope we'll read it soon.
Yeah, I would love to know where he's getting that from. But, all right, everyone. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.